Section 31 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by ShrimpPhish. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 11, Part 3. It seems to me that I should have sunk under the trials of this solitary imprisonment if I had not been relieved by an occasional removal for another examination. First, I was taken out under guard to General Beauregard's office for close questioning. Again remanded to jail, I was once more taken out and led to the Provost Marshal's office, thence to the Yankee Hospital, and thence again to General Beauregard's, where I was renewedly examined by his Chief of Staff, General Thomas Jordan. No direct intimation was given to me in any of these examinations as to the reason for my treatment, yet I suspected, from remarks which were dropped by others, that I was looked at as one who was likely to be executed. Long afterwards I ascertained that word had come to General Beauregard from the Yankee Hospital that I was recognized as a probable spy by one who had seen me at Kinston on a flag of truce the year before. I later found an account of this in the Charleston Courier. In the excited state of the public mind just then, I was quickly arrested, and might have been quickly disposed of, without due examination, if my release had not just then been demanded by a flag of truce from General Gillmore, at the request of General Terry, on the ground of my unfair detention. This made me a subject of negotiation, and it became necessary to have proof that I was not what I claimed to be, before extreme measures were adopted by my captors. Therefore, these repeated examinations were made in search of incriminating evidence. At the time, these examinations were a relief to me. Even the gallows would have seemed preferable, for a change, to that fearful confinement, alone and in inaction. When taken back to the jail after the last questioning, I was put into another room with only an iron grating for a door, so that I could see and converse with those in the corridor beyond. It seemed good to speak again to a fellow man, even the poorest specimen of his kind, as when a prisoner came to the grating and told, as he talked, of a cold-blooded murder he had committed, for which he would probably be hanged. When, indeed, just after this, a young naval surgeon, who had been captured much as I was, while seeking to help the wounded on Morris Island, and who had been with me in the Yankee Hospital, was brought to my new quarters as a roommate. The feeling of relief and fellowship was positive and refreshing, and as the day following we learned that we were actually to be forwarded to Columbia to rejoin our fellow Union prisoners, including my friend, Adjutant Camp, I felt that life was no longer a burden, and that the gallows would not be preferable to confinement in the Southern military prison. Comfort is a relative term, after all. Contentment depends not so much on what we have, as upon what we are, and the light in which we see our possessions. From Charleston we were taken by a night train to Columbia. We were in a comfortable first-class car with our accompanying guard. We slept and waked by turns as we rode, with an occasional glimpse of some peculiarly southern sight of those wartime days. At Branchville, an important junction, where we made quite a stop, lunch tables in the open air were along the station platforms, at which negro mammies were selling snacks of fried chicken and corn cakes, with hot rye coffee, to Confederate soldiers, who were the only white men we saw on the route, while blazing torches of light wood, pieces of dense pitch pine, swung by negro men, or piled on standing mortar boards on the platform, cast their weird glare over the picturesque scene, sending their clouds of smoke outward and upward as a relieving background. Reaching Columbia in the early morning, we were taken to the office of Colonel Preston, the post commandant, where we waited for his representative to appear. On the arrival of the adjutant, he received us as prisoners from the Charleston Guard. and we were taken to Richland jail for confinement. It is not often that going to jail is a joy to a soldier, but, in view of my Charleston experiences in solitary confinement, it was with a glad heart that I passed the doors of the jail in Columbia, and found myself once more in the companionship of my friend, Adjutant Camp, and his fellow Union officers. Prison life in Columbia was more tolerable than prison life in Charleston, although it was still prison life, and therefore hard for a soldier in wartime. The jail itself was more like a large private dwelling than like a fortress. It was near the center of the city, on one of the principal streets, close by the town hall, underneath which was the city market. The jail windows were iron barred, but light and air had free ingress, and it was pleasant for us to watch the signs of life outside, day by day. A central passageway from front to rear divided the 6 rooms on the lower floor. Back of the jail was an open yard, with rude barracks structures, on the one hand for laundry work and storage, and on the other hand for extra prisoners in an emergency. Beyond this was a large printing and lithographic establishment, in which were prepared the treasury notes of the Confederate government, and through the windows of which were to be seen bright-faced young women at work. Sentries paced their beat on all sides of the jail building, day and night. 2 connecting rooms on one side of the lower floor were occupied by our Union Army officers at the time I entered. In the 3rd room on that side, at the rear, were Confederate prisoners, conscript deserters, and others under special charges. Across the hall from our rooms there was a small room near the front, in which was a Union officer from Tennessee, under suspended death sentence as a deserter from the Confederate Army. He was watched day and night by a soldier chained or secured to him, so as to preclude all possibility of escape. The back room on the same side was, at that time, used as quarters for the prison guard. The middle room was just then vacant, but it was subsequently occupied by naval officers captured in Admiral Dahlgren's unsuccessful assault on Fort Sumter. On the 2nd floor of the jail were confined for a time 100 and more of our enlisted men, taken prisoners on Morris Island, and in another room various Confederate prisoners. Enlisted men of the Navy, captured in the assault on Fort Sumter, were, when brought in, assigned to the barrack buildings in the backyard. The only furniture in our 2 rooms was a rude 2-story bedstead, or pair of berths, looking like one plain table set on top of another, capable of holding 8 officers. Also a long pine table, on which 3 more officers could stretch themselves at night. The other officers slept on the floor, with such covering as they could obtain from outside. If we had money, as some of us had, we could purchase little conveniences through officers of the guard. Adjutant Camp and I purchased a bed tick of common brown sheeting, and had it filled with dry pine needles. Also a similar pillowcase filled with corn husks. An officer of the guard loaned us a blanket. This fitted us out very comfortably for the night, and the bed, when rolled up, was a good seat by day. On the tower of the town hall near us was an iron-railed balcony, just below the clock face, where a vigilant lookout paced his nightly rounds. At 8:45 the curfew bell was rung vigorously as a signal for the housing of Negro slaves all over the city, and the making ready for the night. 15 minutes later, when the clock had ceased its strokes of 9, the watchman's voice rang out in a peculiar tone that could be heard from afar in the stilly night. "Past 9 o'clock!" At 9:15, his encouraging cry in the same tone was, "All's well!" At the half hour, his cry was at the full hour, and at the 3rd quarter as at the 1st. This continued through the night. It was a pleasant survival of the old English custom, which had its attractions because of its suggestion of watchfulness. If the southern air had been cooler in July and August, and mosquitoes and vermin had been fewer and less active, we might have slept composedly on our prison floor bed. Daily rations were furnished us of beef or ham, and cornmeal and rice. These we must cook, or have cooked for ourselves, and, if we desired anything more, we could purchase it at our own cost. Slave women were coming and going, in the early morning, in the vicinity of the market, with supplies of fruit and vegetables, and coffee and its substitutes, and from them we could purchase what we would with the permission of our guard. We employed a slave woman to cook for our officers' mess. After several experiments in this line, we settled down on Old Maggie, a typical Southern mammy. She was perhaps 70 years old, a gray-haired, yellow-skinned, wrinkled granny, barefooted and wearing a red and white checked turban and a scant-skirted homespun gown. Quite short, very thin, active, and animated, she was efficient and determined, and served us faithfully. She had had 16 children, and grandchildren, and great-grandchildren in corresponding numbers. Her owner lived up in the country, and she hired her time of him at $2 a week, while she had a stall in the market and did outside jobs. 2 of her great-grandchildren were her immediate attendants. While ordinarily good-natured, she could, on occasion, scold and swear immoderately. Prices for fruit and vegetables in their season were reasonable, but those for coffee, milk, and sugar were beyond all reason in Confederate money. Rio coffee cost $7 a pound, therefore it could not be afforded as a daily beverage. We used in place of it ground parched rye, or barley, or Indian corn. The daily question was, "Shall we have Rio coffee or rye today?" Milk was then 50 cents a quart, and butter was $3 a pound. Poor tallow candles cost us 75 cents each. A common crockery plate cost $2, and a bowl the same. 2 iron spoons were bought by us for $1. We paid $3 for a horn comb, and $2 for a toothbrush. Yet we were glad to have these things at even these prices. Each day we were permitted to have an hour in the yard for exercise, a few officers at a time. This was a great relief. We were like schoolboys at recess. Wrestling, quoit pitching, leapfrog, hopscotch, and boys' games generally, were the order of the hour. We also did our own clothes washing at such times. There was a hydrant in the yard, but water from the pipes was too warm for drinking. The special privilege was given us of going out, 2 at a time, under guard, to draw water from a cool well at a considerable distance from the jail. This was a coveted service. It was looked upon as a promotion to be a drawer of water for our comrades. Little honors were great ones in prison. After a while this privilege was taken from us, because of its offense to citizens who disliked the appearance of Yankee prisoners on their streets. One day, as Adjutant Camp and I drank from the bucket on the well curb, 2 little boys were watching us. As we turned away, one of them said feelingly, "I was going to ha' drinked, but them Yanks ha' spoiled the well." And it was too bad. End of section 31.
Section 32 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 11, Part 4. The officers of our guard were soldiers temporarily disabled for more active service. As soldiers, they gave us soldierly treatment. We were grateful for their immediate course toward us. Yet we were their prisoners, and as such we were necessarily in a hostile attitude toward them. We represented the federal government. They represented the Confederacy. They held us in confinement, without any promise on our part. It was our duty to escape if we could. It was their duty to prevent our doing so. We were desirous of getting information from without. They tried to keep it from us. All this called for alertness on both sides. We could almost always depend on the slaves to aid us to the extent of their ability. They tried various ways of getting to us the daily papers, which we were denied by the authorities. At first they concealed a paper in their garments, and managed to deliver it under the eye of a corporal or sergeant of the guard, who always came in with our cook. Some of us would get between him and her, and engage him in conversation, or arrest his attention by some altercation, while she passed over the paper. When this plan was discovered, the cook was searched before she entered, and we had to try another way. For a time the small newspaper, closely folded, was put inside of a large loaf of corn cake, hollowed out for the purpose. But when they learned of this, they cut open every loaf before it was given to us. Then we tried a new plan. Picking up in the backyard a tin blacking box cover, we fitted its plate into the lid of the coffee pot in which old Maggie brought our steaming hot rye coffee. The blacking box plate served as an inner lid to the coffee pot cover, being secured in place by the bending down of slots in the rim of the cover with corresponding notches in the plate. The newspaper, closely folded, was packed in the space between the two covers thus secured to the coffee pot. When the coffee pot was opened, as it always was, for examination, before our guard would leave it with us for the morning, the outcoming steam would so far confuse his sight that he never suspected there was anything contraband there. Of course the paper was wet with steam when taken out, but it was handled carefully and dried thoroughly before we read it. Thus, in one way or another, we had the news of the day, with very rare exceptions, during all our imprisonment. Although we were supposed to have no direct communication with prisoners in other parts of the jail, we had little difficulty in keeping up full correspondence with them. By a series of agreed signals with the Confederate prisoners in the room back of ours, we knew when it was safe to pass a word along. Then we would send a letter from our room to theirs, through a break in the plaster of the intervening partition near the floor. That letter would by them be attached to a bent pin, lowered by a thread through the ceiling and floor above, and be drawn up by our enlisted men. In like manner a letter would come back to us, or be lowered to our naval officers on the opposite side of the hall. In this way plans for escape were considered, and important information was communicated. In sight from our jail windows was the office of one of the daily newspapers. Its bulletin board was nearby, at the corner of two of the principal streets. The conduct of those who stopped to read these bulletins gave us a pretty good idea of the nature of any fresh intelligence. When men read slowly, and moved off with downcast heads, we took courage as to the progress of affairs in the great struggle. When they showed delight at what they saw, and evidently congratulated one another on the good news, we were correspondingly depressed. We saw reinforcements for General Bragg at Chickamauga, on their way from General Lee's army, passing in sight of our windows, and it was hard to be unable to notify our commanders of this movement of troops. Prisoners from the army of General Rosecrans, in the battle which followed that movement, were taken toward Salisbury, before our eyes but beyond our greeting, when we longed to give them words of sympathy and cheer. News of Federal losses and defeats, and rumors of retaliatory measures which should cause the wholesale execution of prisoners on both sides, were inevitably depressing. And it was so hard to be inactive while intense action seemed the only life worth living. We had our occupations and diversions in our jail rooms. 2 German-American officers gave us lessons in German. 2 others were our instructors in phonography. We whittled out a set of wooden chessmen, and had a series of competitive chess games. Adjutant Camp was a fine player, having been president of the Yale Chess Club while in college. He was sometimes personally matched against all the other good players united, while the rest of us watched the contest with interest. As we were shut up to our dull life in common, with no opportunity to work off surplus feeling in any outside effort, It was easy to get up an excitement without much seeming provocation. Some of our more mischievous fellows would take advantage of this, and stir up an unexpected breeze when there seemed a dead calm. One of our phonographic teachers was an enthusiastic admirer of Pitman's system, the other inclined to Graham's modification of Pitman. Often they discussed the rival systems earnestly. The rest of us took no part. One evening, when things inside were peculiarly dull, the Pitman man ventured a remark in praise of his favorite. A waggish young officer whispered to me, "Who was that other fellow that they talk about?" "Graham," I answered. Then he spoke aloud. "I've understood that Graham's system is a good deal better than Pitman's." This was an unlooked-for friend of the enemy. The Pitman man was aroused. Like a flash, he sprang to the defense of his hero, and the follower of Graham replied vigorously to his opponent. Soon the air of the jail was thick with excited controversy, and it was more like a theological or scientific combat between friends and foes of higher criticism, or of evolution, than like a quiet military prison. Meantime the waggish officer who set the thing a-going was laughing in his sleeve, if he had on a sleeve just then, over the combustibility of tinder under flint and steel. Occasionally we had a share in a special entertainment in the neighboring town hall. Our stage box in the jail was secured to us for the season for whatever performances went on there, and we had no fear of being crowded out by a rush of other spectators. We could hear the speeches in political meetings there, and no one took more interest than we in what was said. A Negro minstrel performance by imitation Negroes seemed to us a poor substitute for the genuine article, as we had been familiar with it in New Bern and on St. Helena Island. But it was a great deal better than nothing, and we retained our box through it all. By and by there came a Madame Rule, a refugee from New Orleans, with a corps of good assistants, and gave several concerts. We were all on hand those nights. Every jail window seat that looked toward the hall was crowded. Earnest faces were pressing between the bars above and below. Strains of stirring and of plaintive music coming through the still air across the starry night, with their thrilling associations of former times in other places, touched our hearts with unwonted power. We held our breath at her sweetest strains, and we dared not show one another how deeply the music moved us. When at last she sang Home, Sweet Home, it was more than we could bear. It was harder than ever to sleep that night in the dreary jail, as we tried not to think of home. With all the occasional lights on its gloom, our life in prison was still gloomy prison life. With all the soldierly treatment of their soldier prisoners by the Southern officers immediately over us, we were subject to the caprices of their enlisted men, volunteers, or conscripts, sometimes coarse, ignorant, and even brutal, in spirit and conduct, who were on guard in charge of us, and even the officers themselves were at times compelled to carry out orders from those above them, which they could not but regret. The Confederate prisoners on the floor above us were even more severely dealt with than ourselves. They were forbidden to stand near the iron-barred windows looking out into the yard. One afternoon we heard several shots in succession and a subsequent commotion in the rooms above. In a few minutes we learned that one of the guard, concealed in an outbuilding in the yard, had, without warning, fired at Confederate prisoners who were quietly looking out of their windows, and killed 2 of them within 5 minutes. The sergeant of the guard told us, boastingly, that that man had killed 2 men in firing only 3 shots. As there had been no outbreak among the prisoners, but merely a careless looking out of the window into the jail yard, we chafed indignantly under this cruel severity on the part of those who were over us. When the bodies of those dead prisoners were brought from the upper floor past our room doors, it was hard for us to contain ourselves in our helplessness. A few days later, one of our fellow officers, who had been severely wounded, and had lain several weeks in the hospital, had taken his seat in one of the windows looking toward the town hall, in order to get a little fresh air on a hot afternoon. We had not been forbidden to keep back from the windows, but a brutal sentry came up from outside and told the wounded captain to get out of his place or he would shoot him. Our poor weak companion attempted to comply with the sentry's demand. But one of our number sprang up into the window seat and, putting his body in front of the captain, said indignantly, "If you want to shoot anybody, shoot a well man. Don't be so cowardly as to shoot down a poor, sick, wounded officer. Take a well one if you must shoot anybody. We shouldn't be in here as prisoners if we hadn't been willing to face shooting. Shoot away, then, if you want to." Instead of firing, the sentry lowered his musket from his shoulder and moved off on his beat. The noise of the altercation was heard by the lieutenant on duty. He came in to inquire its cause. Learning the facts, he put another man on that sentry's beat, and said that we might occupy the window seats as we pleased. These incidents were not composing to the intense nature of a soldier prisoner, and it was hard to keep an equable frame of mind. End of section 32. Section 33 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 11, Conclusion. For a while, 2 of our naval officers were held in irons in a separate room, as hostages for 2 Confederate officers held by our government on a charge of piracy. 2 of our Army officers were similarly shut away from their fellows, because of an attempt to escape. Such things increased and intensified our prison life trials. Imprisonment did not shut me off from opportunities of service as a chaplain. Every evening I conducted prayers with my companions in misfortune, before we lay down to sleep. On Sundays I led in a service of worship in our officers' quarters. After a while, our naval officers from across the hall had permission to come into our room at this hour, and they were glad to avail themselves of the opportunity. I obtained permission to go upstairs and preach to our enlisted men, and again to go out into the yard and preach to our sailors there. We organized a choir of singers in both places, which added greatly to the attractiveness of the services. Pastoral work seemed even more effective in prison than in camp. Men were glad to speak out their heart thoughts to one who could proffer them sympathy in their need. Many privileges were accorded me in this line, and I have precious memories of personal interviews with soldiers and sailors in that jail, who afterwards went out to Salisbury and Andersonville to suffer and to die, far from home and friends. As I had a little money with me to the last, I would buy a supply of soft bread each day, and, standing at the door of my quarters while the men were passing along on the way from the hour of recreation in the yard to their room above, I would give a portion to the more needy on the sick list. Of course this was appreciated by men who had no other variation from the coarse corn bread of their prison fare. As I handed a loaf to a worn and sickly-looking German soldier one day, he smiled a forlorn smile as he thanked me for my kindness, and added his extra petition, as if to say that there was one thing better than bread. "Chaplain, I wish you would pray to good God that he take us out of this damn hole." It was in the spirit of earnest prayer, even though not in conventional phrase, that he blurted out this heart cry. Confinement and constant nervous strain were too much for me. After a few months' imprisonment, my health gave way, and I had an attack of low fever. A Confederate surgeon was called in and prescribed for me. Had it not been for the unremitting tender ministry, in care and sympathy, of my loved friend Adjutant Camp, I should have sunk beyond hope of recovery. He would not let me go down. He breathed his own courage and hope into my failing spirits. He gave me life when mine was going out. When I seemed at the lowest point, he secured for me nourishing food from outside, because I was unable to find needed sustenance in prison fare. We had learned that board at a good hotel was then costing $20 a day in Confederate currency. He sent by one of the guard a request for as good a meal for me as could be obtained at the best hotel in the city. He was ready to part with his gold watch to pay for this, if necessary. The tempting food came in. It rallied me by its appetizing and nutritious qualities. When he asked for the bill, he was told that the proprietor would not take a cent for it, as he learned that it was for a sick chaplain. It was just at that time that the order came for my removal to Richmond, presumably on my way to freedom. And I have always felt that my life was saved in this way. 6 years after this incident, I was in Savannah, Georgia, with a friend who had been an officer in the Confederate Army and a prisoner of war in Fort Delaware. We were talking over war times together. We were in the office of the Screven House. My friend mentioned that the proprietor of the Screven House had had charge of a hotel in Columbia during the war. At this I questioned the proprietor about the dates of his life there. He mentioned incidentally that, in the fall of 1863, he had heard of a sick Union chaplain in Richland jail, and sent him as good a meal as he could provide. I was that sick Union chaplain, I said, and I have always felt that that meal was one of the things that saved my life when I was sinking under prison life and prison fare. My heavens, you the man! I'm glad I sent it then. And I was glad. It was good to rise up from that jail floor and take a start toward home. But it was hard to part with my loved friend, Adjutant Camp, leaving him in the gloomy prison house. It was like the parting of friends when one is going out into the freedom of a better life beyond, and the other is to stay behind. Each was glad, and each was sad. It must be so. Dr. Luck, the naval surgeon, was my companion toward Richmond. Before 5 o'clock in the morning, we, with several Confederate conscripts and deserters, who were to be left at Wilmington, North Carolina, were on our way, under guard, to the railroad station, to take the early train northward. The sergeant in charge of us was a gentlemanly college student, and he made the journey as pleasant as he could for us. It was a slow journey at the best. We had long waits at junctions. Once we were delayed for hours during the night by a broken-down freight train, and then were obliged to go on foot around the wreck, and take a train on the other side. The cars were crowded with Confederate officers and men. We conversed freely with them, and this without any bitterness on either side. There were many expressions of Union sentiment. Indeed, with all the degree of unanimity there was among the people of the South as to the war against the government, I never at any time in my army service met a number of them while I was on flag of truce, or in my prison life, without finding some expression of hearty love for the Union, and of earnest hope for the triumph of the United States government. After a stop over a part of Sunday night at a hotel in Petersburg, we came into Richmond early on Monday morning, too early to report at the Provost Marshal General's office. In a Richmond restaurant, by consent of the sergeant, I bought a cup of hot rye coffee for $1.50, and found it very refreshing. Being taken, as soon as he came to his office, before General John H. Winder, familiarly known from his West Point days as Hog Winder, Provost Marshal General of the Confederacy, in charge of all prisoners of war, we were remanded to the Libby prison, and were started thither. As we passed through the streets, snow, from a sudden cold flurry, was driven in our faces. I had on only the thin clothing, worn thinner by jail wear, in which I had been captured below Charleston in the heat of July. It was now the second week in November. The cold wind of that wintry day cut to the bones of my emaciated frame. Nothing but the trying side of a soldier's life was just then prominent in my personal situation. But just then I thanked God that my life was likely to be once more in the war for the life of our God-given government. Libby Prison was a very different place from the jail at Charleston, or at Columbia. Life here was very different from life there. The Richmond Building, near the James River, on Carey Street, was an extensive 3-story brick structure, formerly occupied by Libby and Company as a ship chandlery establishment. Its rooms, quite low between joists, were broad, long, and capacious. There were 6 large rooms for prisoners, besides the kitchens, mess rooms, and a hospital. The commandant's office was on the ground floor, at the right of the main entrance. Below the street, in the cellar, were dungeons for the confinement of prisoners in disfavor. Only officers held as military prisoners were in the Libby. On the opposite side of Carey Street, a little to the west, was Castle Thunder, another brick warehouse, for the confinement of prisoners of state held on special charges. On Belle Isle, in the James River, in sight from the windows of the Libby, were our enlisted men, in far worse plight than the officers. Taken into the office of the Libby, I was examined by Major Turner, the prison commandant. He was a gentleman in comparison with Dick Turner, the prison inspector, who was a man of the old-time slave overseer sort. Yet I had been told by one of the veteran Confederate officers over us at Columbia that I might not expect the same treatment at the Libby as at Columbia, for Major Turner has never been in active service. Yet I had no cause of complaint of his treatment of me personally. It was indeed trying to a soldier to find the United States flag, Union down, fastened behind Major Turner's desk in that prison office, and it was with a feeling of relief that I received the order to pass up to the floor above and share the lot of my fellow prisoners. As I ascended the ladder leading to the upper rooms, and my head showed itself above the floor to the crowd of prisoners there, I was greeted by the cry from 100 voices, "Fresh fish! Fresh fish! Fresh fish!" And that gave me a place as a freshman in the great prison college, where the seniors were known as sardines. Nearly 1,000 Union officers were in the Libby at that time. It was a bewildering throng in which I found myself as I stood among those who pressed forward at the announcement of a new prison comer. It seemed as though there was no more standing room for prisoners, and how all could find room to lie down was a matter of wonder. It was not easily arranged, after all. When night came, the officers stood in rows, each in his appointed place, and then they lay down, so closely packed that the floor was literally covered by them. All must go to bed, and all must get up, by agreement. There was no walking around by a restless sleeper, no getting up in advance of one's fellows in the morning. There seemed to be no space for me on the overpacked floor, and at first I thought I must stand up all night. But provision was made for me. General Neal Dow of Maine was at that time the ranking officer in the Libby. Naturally, he had a little larger space than the others assigned to him, and he generously accorded me room to lie down on his floor patch, which was in the center of the front end of the second story of the Libby. Most of the windows at both ends of the room had been broken out, and, although the spaces were barred, the cold winds swept through pitilessly. No sunlight found its way in, even on a bright day, and the bare floors were damp all day and all night from each morning's washing. In my weak and worn condition, I was cold all the time. When night came, I must shiver in my one thin blanket. Falling asleep, I would dream of being near a fire, trying to warm myself, and then I would awake to find it was a dream. Of all forms of mere physical discomfort, I never knew anything more trying than this continuous shivering with cold by day and by night. "Skirmish for graybacks" was the morning signal in the Libby for preparing to rise. Each officer then, sitting up in his place, would strip off his upper garments and cleanse himself from vermin for the day. Graybacks was the popular term for a Confederate enemy, and again for our most obnoxious insect foe. It was a strange sight, those long rows of Union officers, including men in the highest spheres of life in the North, industriously striving to exterminate their insect enemy, which was fattening itself on the best blood in the land. It was a struggle for the survival of the fittest. When all was ready, men stood up for the new day, to answer to the prison roll call from Dick Turner. The bare, cobwebbed, and dusty walls of the prison rooms had been nailed, and pegged, and shelved, and cord strung, for the hanging and stowing of cups, and pots and pans, and jars, and bottles, and books, and musical instruments, and fencing foils, and smaller articles of clothing, while between the naked floor beams above were hanging, on lines, blankets and shawls and overcoats and towels. On the floor were boxes and raised barrels, and an occasional crippled chair, for seats. These made the place look more like a pawnbroker's or a city junk shop than like our Columbia jail quarters. At the end of each main room was a single water faucet, where the 150 to 200 inmates of that room could wash, without basin or tub, when they could get access to it. The eating rooms on the lower floor had rude tables of unplaned boards running their entire length, with narrow benches of the same material alongside of them. Along the sides of these eating rooms were 10 small cook stoves, at each of which 100 men must do their cooking for the day. Thorough system and prompt work were necessary to secure this. Our officers must arrange for it. They had an organization, with the ranking officer in prison as the commandant, and a designated adjutant, and a commissary. Groups of officers formed into messes, each man in turn sharing in the cooking for his mess, and putting into the common stock his portion of fuel. The messes agreed together as to the hour of the day or night when they could have the use of the stove during the next week. Thus the stoves were in use all the 24 hours, and this was none too much time. Meals in the Libby at the best were not of the best. One of my fellow officers found a whole rat baked into a loaf of corn cake furnished with his rations. The rat had probably jumped into the dough trough while the corn cake was making, and been knocked in the head and worked into the cake. It was not a good appetizer. Another fellow officer, a cultivated Boston gentleman, was cooking for his mess at one time. He made a savory dish for himself of pea soup by boiling a lot of beans together with a fresh ham bone. It was midnight when the soup was cooked. If he should eat it before he slept, he would lose the pleasant feeling of having a full stomach while wide awake. Therefore he set it aside until daylight. On looking at it in the morning, he found its surface covered with cooked maggots. He could not but be glad that he had not eaten it in the dark. But he welcomed the next prison meal, because it was the best he could get. During the day there were classes in German, in French, and in phonography. Men played cards, or chess, or checkers. Others fenced with prison-made foils. Some sketched. Some carved beef-bone napkin rings, or shirt studs, or seals, or other ornaments. Some made thread tatting as they had learned to in boyhood. All knew well that the hardest work in the world is to do nothing, and no one attempted that. Boxes from the Sanitary Commission, and from the Christian Commission, containing supplies for the prisoners, as well as boxes from home friends, were now being received at the Libby, thus supplying them with comforts we had lacked in Columbia. It would have gladdened the home hearts to see the delight with which a prisoner unpacked the box from his dear ones, and gloated over each longed-for or unexpected treasure in the gloom of his prison house. There were prison amusements of their kind. The Libby minstrels and the Libby warblers gave an occasional concert. Now and then there was a lecture by some officer on a topic of interest to all. Moreover, there were well-attended prayer meetings 3 evenings of the week. When there were any chaplains in prison, there were religious services, with sermons, twice each Sunday, and even when there was no chaplain, some non-clerical officer often performed this duty. It was only at occasional intervals that a prisoner was released from the Libby, while exchanges were suspended. Hence, when a man was released, he had many messages from the prisoners to their friends. As he was searched for contraband articles on going out, as on coming in, it was not easy to carry a note undetected. But a man can generally do what he has to do. An important message was carried, in one instance, on very thin paper rolled up in tinfoil, and pressed into and on top of a decayed back tooth. Many a message was written in lemon juice, to be brought out by heat, between the lines of an open letter submitted for examination. At last the authorities realized that the tricks of Yankees could not be found out by examination. Therefore they dropped the searching, and put a prisoner on his word of honor not to carry any written communication of any sort from anyone inside to anyone outside. A soldier, of course, regarded that assurance, even to an enemy in wartime, binding on him without qualification. Then the memory had to be substituted for writing. As it was understood that I would soon pass through the lines, I was plied with verbal messages to those at home. One man, whose family lived near Borden's condensed milk factory, wanted me to ask his wife to have a $20 gold piece sealed up in a can of milk at that factory, and then to send the can to him in a box of home comforts by flag of truce. He knew that at the Libby they would simply punch a hole in the can to see that it contained milk, and then hand it over. A man who lived near the Willimantic Thread Company wanted his wife to go to the factory and have a $20 greenback wound round a spool before the thread was machine wound over it. The factories were always ready then to help a soldier in such ways. I planned to send a letter, in one instance, between the layers of the pasteboard bottom of a little box that had an unsuspicious look, with its harmless contents of sewing and writing materials. Again I sent maps and a pocket compass, with other helps for a fugitive, in the double bottom of a wooden packing box. In order to avert suspicion of the fact that the box had a double bottom, the bottom was 2 double bottoms side by side, with a space between them, so that when the contents were turned out, the authorities would see the light shining through the bottom of the box, and be convinced that there was no double bottom there. Thus, in one way and another, help was to come to those in prison from those outside, although I bore no written message from any one inside the Libby to any person outside. "Boat up! Boat up!" was the glad cry that rang through the Libby rooms one day, when the news came that a flag of truce boat had just come from City Point, bringing a mail for prisoners, and possibly bringing orders for the release of some of us. Then followed the thrilling reception and distribution of the home mail. Another night on the cold floor, with the restless, anxious hoping that it might be my last there, although all was still uncertainty. There was a rumor that several of us were to go back in this boat, but no one knew how the rumor started. About noon of the following day, Dick Turner made his appearance at the entranceway of our room. His voice rang out, as his first call. "Chaplain H. Clay Trumbull of the 10th Connecticut." I had never in my life been so glad to hear my own name as then. I sprang toward him at his call. He said, "If you want to go back in this boat, hurry up." "Is there time for me to run upstairs and get my things?" "No. Go just as you are, or not at all." I had left upstairs, on the floor above, a little basket of my belongings, which I had brought from Columbia. But it was nothing in comparison with liberty. I left all, and followed him who gave me hope of freedom. As I passed out from the Libby and down Carey Street, under guard, I looked up and saw the glad, sad faces of my fellow prisoners crowding the windows of that gloomy building. Their kindly farewells made my heart sick, because I must leave them there. Goodbye, Chaplain. I'm glad you are going home. God bless you, Chaplain. I wish I was going with you. Goodbye. Goodbye. These sounds are in my ears today, as fresh as 35 years ago. I went on the little steamer, A.H. Schultz, down the James River. A white flag was above her bow. The Confederate flag was above her stern. Until the steamer had passed the defenses of Richmond, I was kept below. As we neared City Point, I was permitted to come on deck. When I came in sight of the United States flag, floating over our flag of truce steamer New York, I could hardly contain myself for joy, but I had to be restrained until formally released. I was compelled to pass one more night under the Confederate flag. I was, however, treated courteously by Captain Hatch, the Confederate agent of exchange, and I made myself as contented as possible until the hour for my transfer. On the following morning I was given over by Captain Hatch to Major Mulford, our agent of exchange, and my prison experiences were at an end. From Major Mulford I learned more about my imprisonment and my return. My government had steadily pressed for my release. Finally, Judge Ould, the Confederate Commissioner of Exchange, asked Major Mulford if he could give his personal assurance that I was what I claimed to be, a simple chaplain, and not a spy. The Major said he had relatives in Hartford, where I lived, and could easily ascertain the truth. The judge said if he was satisfied on this point, I should be released. He also promised not to use to my disadvantage the Major's silence on the subject, if he found he could not vouch for me. Major Mulford, afterwards General Mulford, had a cousin living near me, connected with the church of which I was a member. In response to his inquiry, she spoke of me in such terms that he was no longer in doubt. He told Judge Ould, and an order was sent to General Beauregard for my release. When Richmond was taken, a friend of mine, in command at the Libby, found among the official files an important paper in my case, and gave it over to me. It contained the order of Judge Ould for my transfer to Richmond, in response to the demand of General Meredith, our agent of exchange, with the protest of General Jordan, General Beauregard's chief of staff, endorsed on it. Chaplain H. Clay Trumbull has been directed to be sent to Richmond at once. He is a tricky fellow, and has little the air of a chaplain. The great desire manifested to get him back, coupled with the circumstances of his capture, make it doubtful whether he is really a chaplain or a spy. Some years after the war, a man, who then met me for the first time, said, "Mr. Trumbull, you don't look a bit like a minister." "I know that," I replied. "I once came near being hanged for it. Because of my lack of the conventional choker, they proposed to give me one of hemp." End of section 33.
Section 34 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by lightcrystal. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 12. Glimpses of General Grant. Because a man is in an army, it does not follow that he has any personal knowledge of its commander-in-chief. He may know a great deal about him. He may even have studied his character and history for years. He may be guided in his everyday life by the orders issued by that commander-in-chief. Yet, while serving under him for a prolonged term, he may never have a glimpse of him, any more than if an ocean separated them. all his knowledge of the man who is so much to him may be only at second hand, as hearsay information. This is not the popular opinion of army service. It certainly was not the idea which was in my mind as a boy, when occasionally I met an old soldier of the American Revolution or of the great Napoleon. At one time, when I went with my father to pay some pension money to an old coloured man who had served in the Revolutionary War, I asked the pensioner, with interest, what he could tell me about the appearance of General Washington. The old man was too kind-hearted to disappoint his benefactor's boy by telling the truth, and saying that he had never set eyes on the commander-in-chief, so he replied at once, General Washington was a grand and imposing man. He'd come out afore the line every morning and speak out in a loud voice, Boys, I want you all to be good soldiers today. Every one of us stand ready to die for the general. That met a boy's idea of army service. A good many older persons felt as that boy did about soldiers serving always under the eye of the commander-in-chief. They took it for granted that a revolutionary soldier was accustomed, as a matter of course, to see General Washington at least frequently, even if not every day. A little later, when I was presented in my father's sitting room to Colonel John Trumbull, the artist, who served on the personal staff of General Washington as an aide-de-camp, I was interested in being face to face with a man who had had special opportunities of knowing the father of his country and of feeling his impress. But somehow, as he said nothing of the personal appearance and ways of General Washington, I found that my early thoughts were most influenced as to these by the words of the old coloured pensioner. Personal testimony as to a great commander's looks and ways is very effective when you know or think that it is all true. When once I saw an old soldier of the first Napoleon, I asked him what he thought about his great commander. I did not ask how Napoleon looked, but how his soldiers felt about him. The old Frenchman's face was all aglow, and his form was in a quiver, as with excited gestures he exclaimed, "We believed in Napoleon. You believe in your God. We believed in Napoleon. Napoleon say, go to the moon. Every soldier start. Napoleon find the way." Whether that soldier had ever seen Napoleon I did not ask, but I could have no doubt that he had felt his influence, and that he could bear sure testimony of it. Thus with the soldiers of General Grant. Not all of them were privileged to see him personally, but all felt the impress of his personality and the testimony of any one of them who ever saw and heard him, and who was thus the more impressed by him, is worthy of heeding, because it is an added evidence of General Grant's surpassing personality. General Grant was not a grand and imposing man like General Washington, or again like General Scott. Nor was he a man of magnetic and inspiring presence, arousing enthusiasm wherever he showed himself among his soldiers, like Napoleon, or even like McClellan or Sherman, or yet more like Sheridan. Neither his personal appearance nor his manner was calculated to impress the average man with a sense of his greatness, and his soldiers had to learn gradually to trust implicitly the commander who held their lives and the interests of the entire country in his control. I have seen General Grant riding quietly along the front at a time when an important movement of his was evidently a success, as at Fort Harrison in September 1864, and our men were flushed with a sense of victory at the right, while the sounds of battle at the left were still to be heard. Yet not a cheer greeted his progress as he moved among the men who were ready to lay down their lives at his order. I could have heard a cheer from other divisions had it been given on that occasion, as he passed on his way with no show of authority or apparent wish to be greeted, but not a cheer was to be heard. Very different was the case with many another general. When General Burnside showed himself among his soldiers in North Carolina in 1862, the men seemed to go wild with enthusiasm, and it was much the same with General John G. Foster, or later with General Gilmore or General Terry. It is true that Colonel Horace Porter testifies that the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac were aroused to such enthusiasm over their new commander at the opening of the campaign in May 1864 that it was necessary to check their vociferous cheers, lest the noise should disclose the commander's presence to the enemy. Yet anyone familiar with General Grant's appearance and manner on the field would testify to his absence of imposing presence. But gradually, and with increasing force, as the war went on, officers and men came to feel confidence in the wisdom and ability of General Grant, and to have rest in their abiding trust in him as fully competent for whatever he had to do. It was said that when he was in command in the West, the soldiers would look up and say quietly as he passed, "There goes the old man. Pretty hard nut for Johnny Reb to crack." And when it was seen that those commanders who were brilliant and magnetic, and who, like Sherman and Sheridan, could immediately arouse and inspire their men, were themselves aroused and inspired by the supreme ability of General Grant, confidence in him came down through them to those who lacked the ability to measure him for themselves at his true worth, and caused them to perceive in him that greatness which was earlier patent to the larger minds. My first opportunity of seeing General Grant was after he crossed the James River in June 1864 and made his headquarters at City Point. My regiment was then in the Army of the James at Bermuda Hundreds, where General Butler's command was bottled up, we having come hither from the Department of the South. General Grant came over to Bermuda Hundreds with General Butler soon after the Army of the Potomac was in position before Petersburg, and rode along our lines, reconnoitering our defenses. He made less display than General Butler, or than an ordinary division commander, and we failed to see in him evidences of the power that we knew he possessed. A month later, July 16, 1864, when our brigade occupied a newly taken position at Deep Bottom, north of the James River, about 10 miles from Richmond, near the New Market Road, General Grant, accompanied as before by General Butler, passed through our regimental lines toward a house known as the Grover House, for the purpose of sending over to Richmond by flag of truce 2 civilians, Mr. James R. Gilmore, Edmund Kirky, and Colonel Jacques, on a special mission to Jefferson Davis with the consent of President Lincoln. As we then had a better opportunity of observing General Grant personally, we watched him with curious interest, vainly seeking some visible sign of his greatness. General Grant was not given to display in dress or in surroundings. He was seldom in full uniform, and, as he himself says, he rarely wore a sword on the field. Often a single member of his personal staff, and sometimes only a single orderly, accompanied him. On one occasion, as he passed by our regimental camp on the Newmarket Road, below Richmond, with only an orderly and wearing a private soldier's blouse, with no sign of rank other than the 3 stars on his shoulder strap, one of our men said to the others in quiet surprise, "Why, there goes General Grant." "Nonsense," said another. "That isn't General Grant. It doesn't look a bit like him." "Well, I say it is. Don't you see those stars on his shoulder? There's only one man in this army who wears 3 stars. And that was conclusive. When, in the spring of 1865, just prior to the movement of his armies that culminated in victory of Appomattox Courthouse, General Grant reviewed our division, and a week later, when he accompanied Secretary Stanton at a review of our corps, in full uniform as he was, and accompanied by his brilliant staff and distinguished generals, his appearance better met the common idea of the commanding general of a great army. By that time, moreover, even his impassible countenance showed its signs of continual strain and anxiety, and gave proof that he was not insensible to the tremendous responsibilities upon him in that prolonged campaign. Slowly, however, at the best, did the majority of those who were under General Grant grow to any just appreciation of his simple greatness. It was not until after the war that I came into any personal relations with General Grant. My first meeting with him was at his home in Washington, just after his nomination at Chicago as a Republican candidate for the presidency in May 1868. I was returning from a trip to the South. General Joseph R. Hawley, who was chairman of the nominating convention, and who as such was to notify General Grant of his nomination, invited me to accompany him on that occasion. Not reaching Washington in season for this, I ventured to make a personal call on General Grant. On the strength of it, as I came northward, I sent in my card, simply writing under my name, "A friend of General Joseph R. Hawley." In a few minutes, General Grant came in, and greeting me cordially, he said, "Excuse me for keeping you waiting, but I was out in the yard playing circus with my children." This gave me a glimpse of his home life, and newly attracted me to him. I explained the circumstances of my call, and told of my personal relations with General Hawley, adding that I took advantage of this to pay my respects to the commander whom every soldier held so dear. The simplicity and naturalness of General Grant impressed me from the start. I could not but be at my ease as he talked to me familiarly. asking in what command I had served, and about my army service. As I spoke of the time when he rode through the lines of our regiment on his way to the Grover House with Edmund Kirky in July 1864, the general asked artlessly, "What horse did I ride that day?" I suggested that I could not answer that question, for I was thinking just then a good deal more about the man who was so much more to us all than about the horse which he rode. But I was sure it was a good horse. When I proposed to leave, after this first salutation, the general kindly asked me to remain longer, and he spoke of the political outlook. This was at a time when the newspaper correspondents were all speaking of the peculiar reticence of General Grant, the silent man, and the impossibility of getting any expression of opinion from him. Yet he seemed free to express himself without restraint, apparently convinced that no unfair use would be made of it. He spoke warmly of General Hawley, and of his opening address at the nominating convention at Chicago. Then he asked who I thought would be nominated for president by the Democrats. I answered that there seemed more than a possibility that they would nominate Chief Justice Chase. At once General Grant replied, "I hope they'll nominate Chase. Then we shall feel easy for our country in either event." This showed the unselfish and patriotic spirit of General Grant. His chief thought was of the country he loved and served. It was not an opposing candidate who could easily be beaten that he wanted in the field, but one who would be best for the whole country if elected. This was the tenor of General Grant's talk at that time, as of his life throughout. From the time of that first personal interview of mine with General Grant, he grew in my love and admiration continually. On various occasions subsequently, I was brought into pleasant relations with him, and I always found him remarkably free as a conversationalist, whether he was relating incidents of his campaigns or speaking of public affairs. One evening, as 2 or 3 of us sat by him in a private car, he related some of his experiences in the Mexican War while he was still a lieutenant. Our troops under General Taylor had gained a position in the city of Monterey, but the Mexicans were not yet driven out. They were firing from the windows and housetops at our men, who were, for the time, unable to silence their fire. Moreover, our forces were in need of ammunition, and it was a perilous thing to go for it outside. "I volunteered to go for it, and to report our condition," said General Grant. "To do this, I must run the gauntlet of this fire, while every attempt was making to pick me off by the Mexicans. I had a good horse. I swung myself down alongside of the horse, holding on by one leg in the saddle. You see, I could always ride like a monkey. And then I started my horse on a run. The bullets flew pretty lively, but I got through safely." It was interesting to consider, as we heard this recital, what a change there might have been in American history if a Mexican marksman had had a surer aim just then, as he fired at that young lieutenant who was riding monkey fashion out of the streets of Monterey in pursuit of more ammunition. But that head was providentially covered for a purpose in the day of battle. Thus it is that God cares for a people in little things as in great. At another time, as I sat alone with him, General Grant spoke freely of the circumstances of his finally receiving General Butler from command, and of what preceded it. The details of the affair showed the caution, the discernment, and the precision of General Grant's mind. being in doubt about certain matters in General Butler's department, and distrusting reports he received as to a firm of wholesale sutlers and their relations to the enemy, he said, "I knew I could depend absolutely on General George Gordon, so I sent him down there to make thorough investigation." Telling of the obstacles afterwards encountered by General Gordon in his investigations, and of his own determination to have the matter thoroughly sifted, General Grant said, "I concluded it would be best to have General Butler out of the department forthwith, and that was when I issued my order to him to report for orders at once at his home in Lowell." Soon after this recital by General Grant, I met General Gordon, and he gave me the same facts from his side of the story. Such incidents illustrate the freeness of General Grant in speaking of the important matters, when he was under no restraint through fear that he should be misreported or involved in controversy. When, on one occasion, I spoke to General Grant of the sense of personal responsibility which he must have felt for the great number of officers and men under his immediate command, in the widely extended field of our national conflict in the last year of our war, I added, "I should think that the mere carrying in mind the personality of the officers who were to execute your orders in connection with your best laid plans must have taxed any human memory and thought to the utmost. I don't see how it was possible for you to remember all those whom you must have in mind in order to be sure that they could be depended on for the doing of your special work on an occasion, for everything showed that you had considered them all." "As to that matter," he said, "I didn't have to consider, personally, as many men the last year of the war as the first. When I was colonel of a regiment, I knew every man in the regiment, and I had them all in mind. But as I rose in command, I made it my business to keep up my knowledge of the commanders under me sufficiently to be sure that they could be trusted to attend to those whom they commanded, and not to concern myself about others. When I was at the head of all the armies, I didn't specially burden my mind with any man below the rank of division commander. Being sure of these, I could trust them to look out for those below them." End of section 34, part 1.
Section 35 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 12, Part 2. These simple words testified to General Grant's ability to rise to the responsibilities of the highest command without being burdened with the details of a lower position. In this he succeeded, where so many before him had failed. Great administrative ability always shows itself in the power to shut unnecessary details out of mind. Knowing what not to do often settles the question of what to do. Although General Grant was not in the habit of joking, he had a keen sense of humor, and his wit often showed itself in his laconic phrases. I was with him one evening in Governor Burnside's parlor, when I was one of a delegation who had come from Hartford to invite him to that city. As we were talking with him familiarly, Mayor Doyle of Providence came in to say that a large delegation of citizens was outside, having come to serenade the president. Governor Burnside at once stepped to the front window, which opened from the floor, and, throwing it up, stood there with the president while the band serenaded. Mayor Doyle presented the greetings of the assembled citizens to the president, who bowed his acknowledgments. The crowd then clamored for a speech. Governor Burnside said, in response, as the president stood silent by his side, "You know, fellow citizens, that the president doesn't make speeches." "Oh, General Grant, do just say 2 words to us," cried an enthusiastic voice. "I won't," responded General Grant, in a quiet, firm tone, without moving a muscle of his face. The man's request for just 2 words was granted, and the President had not made a speech. The Honorable E.A. Rawlins, who was Commissioner of Internal Revenue at Washington, while General Grant was acting Secretary of War, gave me another illustration of this power of General Grant. A man in New York had been urged on Mr. Rawlins, by a distinguished statesman of the day, for an important position in his department. Wanting to know about the man, he went to General Grant and asked him if he knew him. The general said he did. "I'm urged to appoint him to a responsible position in the Revenue Department, General. What do you think of his fitness for such a place?" asked Mr. Rawlins. "Well," said General Grant, "if I had to choose between taking him or making a scoop at a venture into Sing Sing, I'd try the scoop." Although he was not accustomed to show emotion, and was supposed by many to be regardless of adverse criticism, General Grant was sensitive to the opinion of others, and felt deeply the misjudgment of his spirit and motives by those who ought to have understood him better. Being with him in a private car, on one occasion, during the second term of his administration, I sat near him while no one else was by, and ventured to speak of the love which I, in common with his old soldiers generally, bore him, in view of what he had been to us and to our country when he was all the world to us all. My words seemed to touch his heart, and to start him on a train of thought about the popular judgments of his course. As he thanked me for my grateful words, he continued, in a kind of personal soliloquizing, "I don't wonder that people differ with me, and that they think I am not doing the best that could be done. I can understand how they may blame me for a lack of knowledge or judgment. But what hurts me is to have them talk as if I didn't love my country, and wasn't doing the best I knew how." Then his thoughts seemed to go back to former days, as he continued his soliloquy. "It was just that way in wartime. I didn't do as well as might have been done. A great many times I didn't do as well as I was trying to do. Often I didn't do as well as I expected to do. But I had my plans, and I was trying to carry them out. They called me fool and butcher. They said I didn't know anything, and hadn't any plans. But I kept on, and they kept on, and by Richmond was taken, and I was at Appomattox Courthouse, and then they couldn't find words enough to praise me." Then he returned to present days in his quiet soliloquy. "I suppose it will be so now. In spite of mistakes and failures, I shall keep at it. By and by we'll have specie payments resumed. Reconstruction will be complete. Good feeling will be restored between the North and the South. We shall be at Appomattox again, and then I suppose they'll praise me." That soliloquy of General Grant gave me a glimpse into his great heart. I knew better than before how he felt, how he endured, how he trusted, and how he hoped, and I loved him more than ever. In a message to the people of the United States, in the early days of our centennial year, President Grant invited the churches of all denominations to make some special recognition of the occasion in their public services on the Sunday nearest to July 4, 1876, with a view to impressing its lessons on the community. At this I ventured to write to the President, suggesting that the lessons of our centennial year would have practical value, in proportion as they were impressed on the minds and hearts of the children of the country, who could do most in making them effective in the first third of our second century. In view of this, I asked him if he would not send a message to that effect to the children of our country, through the columns of the principal undenominational weekly Sunday school paper in this country, which I edited. Promptly he acceded to my request, and sent a message as follows: Washington, June 6, 1876. To the Editor of the Sunday School Times, Philadelphia. Your favor of yesterday, asking a message from me to the children and youth of the United States, to accompany your centennial number, is this moment received. My advice to Sunday schools, no matter what their denomination, is: hold fast to the Bible as the sheet anchor of your liberties. Write its precepts in your hearts, and practice them in your lives. To the influence of this book are we indebted for all the progress made in true civilization, and to this we must look as our guide in the future. Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Yours respectfully, U.S. Grant. The influence of this unique message of a President of the United States was very great, copied as it was into well-nigh every paper, religious and secular, in the United States. The appropriateness of the Bible text quoted by him at the close of his message was recognized by all. 20 years later, the same text was quoted by General James Longstreet in a public letter with reference to a great political issue then before the country. On the reading of that letter, General O. Howard, being present, remarked, "I know how that text suggested itself to General Longstreet. It is written on the walls of our chapel at West Point, over the desk. Every cadet remembers that." So it seems that General Grant recalled it out of his early memories when he commended it as a lesson to the young people of the United States. It is a text worthy of remembrance by every lover of his country. It evidently has had its influence on successive generations of young cadets preparing in that chapel for active service as Army officers. On the closing day of the Centennial Exhibition, November 10, 1876, I was witness of an incident that illustrated the promptness and self-reliance of General Grant in deciding what was to be done in an important matter of public policy, and the ease and simplicity with which he expressed himself as to the principles which guided his action. The President and members of his cabinet were in Philadelphia, attending the closing ceremonies of the exhibition. By invitation of my friend General Hawley, President of the exhibition, I was a member of his party. As the President came into General Hawley's office, after formally closing the exhibition, a telegram was handed to him with reference to the condition of affairs in Louisiana and Florida. There was just then an excited state of feeling throughout the country as to the result of the still undecided presidential contest between General Hayes and Mr. Tilden. It was a critical time. There was danger of violence. Anxiety and unrest prevailed. General Grant read the dispatch, and then seated himself at General Hawley's desk, at the invitation of the latter, who handed him telegraph blanks. General Grant had put a cigar in his mouth as he left the hall where the closing ceremonies were held. He said not a word as to the nature of the dispatch he had received, but, with a peculiar movement of the cigar in his mouth, he began at once to write. Secretary of State Fish was in the room, but did not take any part in the proceedings. While the President was writing, Secretary of War Cameron came hurriedly into the room, having apparently heard of the reception of the dispatch. As he approached the President, the latter, without saying a word, pushed toward him the message he had received and went on with his writing. In a few minutes he had finished his answer, and, having simply shown it to Secretary Cameron, it was at once, without change or delay, sent on its way. That was the message sending directions to General Sherman, which stated the President's view of the course to be pursued in the national crisis, and which did so much to reassure public confidence in the President's purpose to maintain law and order at every cost. It read, "Instruct General Augur in Louisiana and General Ruger in Florida to be vigilant with the force at their command to preserve peace and good order, and to see that the proper and legal board of canvassers are unmolested in the performance of their duties. Should there be any grounds of suspicion of fraudulent count on either side, it should be reported and denounced at once. No man worthy of the office of President should be willing to hold it if counted in or placed there by fraud. Either party can afford to be disappointed in the result, but the country cannot afford to have the result tainted by the suspicion of illegal or false returns." As I was within a few feet of General Grant from the time he received the dispatch until he had sent off the reply, I can testify with positiveness as to his immediate and unaided preparation of that explicit and comprehensive order. And when afterward I read in prominent newspapers the suggestion that, in the phrasing of that order, the experienced hand of Secretary Fish was to be seen, or that it bore traces of the adroit shrewdness of Secretary Cameron, I realized that the independent judgment and the wisdom and decision of General Grant, in any crisis, were not yet fully comprehended by the public. It were easy to find evidence of the power of General Grant's personality in whatever sphere he was placed. Taken prisoner on the field of Morris Island, before Charleston, in July 1863, I met there Captain Thomas Y. Simons, in command of a light battery from Charleston. He was of the class of 1849 in Yale. As I knew several of his classmates, we had a pleasant conversation together. He said that he had longed for this conflict for years. He was a secessionist before secession was accomplished. He was a member of the state convention that declared South Carolina out of the Union and voted for that action. And now that the war was in progress, he was sure that it could never end except in the independence of the South. "You can never subjugate us," he said. "We would fight, if need be, till our last man was in the field." Later he called on me in Columbia jail. He spoke again in the same confident strain. The following year he sent a kindly greeting to me across the lines in Virginia, when he found that he was once more over against my regiment. After the war, I learned that he was editor of the Charleston Courier. Being in that city, I called on him. Welcoming me cordially, he said frankly, "Well, Chaplain, when I saw you last, I didn't think the war would end as it did." Then he continued, "But oh dear, I was ready for the end long before it came. We couldn't stand that Grant of yours. It was his eternal pound, pound, pound that did the business. We would have been glad to go into one great battle and fight it out to the finish. But he kept at it all the time. Whether we whipped him or not one day, we had to go at it the next day, and try it over again. He wouldn't give us any rest. Finally we found it was just die today, or tomorrow, or the next day, or next week, and gain nothing by it. There was no other alternative, and we longed for the end to come." General Grant had said, in his final report of his military operations, in command of the army, as to his policy from the beginning, in dealing with the enemies of his government, "I therefore determined first to use the greatest number of troops practicable against the enemy, preventing him from using the same force at different seasons against first one and then another of our armies, and the possibility of repose for refitting and producing necessary supplies for carrying on resistance. Second, to hammer continuously against the armed force of the enemy and his resources, until by mere attrition, if in no other way, there should be nothing left to him but an equal submission with the loyal section of our common country to the Constitution and laws of our land." It was evident that my Charleston friend was at last convinced that General Grant had carried out his determination. That was a peculiarity of General Grant's. On two memorable occasions after this, I was brought into peculiar relations with General Grant and his place in history. Once when he was welcomed home after his triumphant circuit of the globe. Again when he had finished his earthly course, and was laid at rest at Riverside Park. In neither case was it what he said or did, but in both instances it was what others felt and thought about him, that stood out preeminently, and that gives interest to the recollections of an observer. End of section 35. Section 36 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 12, Conclusion. In May 1877, General Grant sailed from Philadelphia on his journey round the world. In December 1879, he reached Philadelphia again by way of the Pacific coast, at the close of that remarkable journey. At this latter time a grand public demonstration by the citizens of Philadelphia was accorded him, which concluded with a formal reception in the Academy of Music. Veterans of the war, with their friends, packed the vast building to its utmost capacity. Their old colors and battle flags were displayed on the platform. Governor Henry M. Hoyt, in the name of the citizens of Pennsylvania, gave General Grant welcome again to the birthplace of that American independence which he had re-secured to the nation. And, deputed by George G. Meade, Post 1, of the Grand Army of the Republic, of which post General Grant was a member, I gave him welcome from his old comrades. Extending this greeting in their name, I naturally suggested, "It might seem that one who has received the glad greetings of all the sovereigns of earth, and who has fairly encircled the globe with the echo of his praises, would tire of even the heartiest expressions of honor or esteem that could come to him from any source or by any person whatsoever. But no true man ever tires of words of love and confidence from those who are dear to him. And as you, sir, have already been reminded, and as a single glance about you would have assured you, this vast assemblage is made up of those who are no strangers to you. They are your old soldiers, your former companions in arms, blood relatives all, and it is not too much to say that they are very dear to you. You depended on them, and they proved true to you, in the hour of need to you and to them, an hour of need to our nation and to humanity. Because then you were capable, and they were trustworthy, you had success, and they had victory and its rejoicings. Here are men from well nigh every field where you did service and won honor, from your Bunker Hill at Belmont to your Yorktown at Appomattox Courthouse. Meeting you again face to face, they cannot but recall those days when you were all the world to them, when you held their lives and honor in your keeping, when on your sagacity, your courage, and your fidelity depended all that they loved or lived for, and for which they were ready to die. As once more they look on you, and on those dear old flags beside you, they remember how, at your order and under your lead, they followed those flags in the storm of battle, or stood by them in the dreary siege, upholding and defending them amid the shower of bullets, or under the crash of bursting shell, on the death-crowned parapet, or in the open field, with ringing charge and countercharge, or on the weary march, by night and by day, in summer's heat and in winter's cold, until the weather-beaten, tattered, and bullet-pierced remnants of those flags bear mute but eloquent witness to the true-hearted devotion of those soldiers and their great commander to the interests of that country which under God he saved, which he has governed so wisely and represented everywhere so grandly, and of which he stands today confessedly the foremost, best-loved citizen. When, in the name of his own post of the Grand Army of the Republic, and of every lover of the Grand Republic itself, I extended to General Grant the hand of heartfelt welcome, and he rose, and with evident emotion returned the hand clasp, while every person in the vast assembly sprang to his feet and joined in the cheers that rang through the building. I knew that he was having a foregleam of the place he was to hold for all time as the preeminent preserver and lover of his country, while his old soldiers, who were present, as representative of all the surviving veterans of the war, felt that the trials and sufferings of that prolonged conflict were not worthy to be compared with the glory and honor given by the whole world to this great nation and this great commander in the attained triumph, in which they had borne so important a part. At last there came the end of that life of heroism and sacrifice, the end of the long days and nights of suffering, while the great soldier battled so bravely with the last enemy he must encounter, the only enemy who ever could bring him even for a time into subjection. Struggling successfully hour by hour with wasting strength to secure competent provision for his own dear ones, and to prepare a new legacy for his countrymen, in the full story of his great campaigns in their behalf, until all was accomplished. he was ready not to do at last. Peace had come to him, and he was at rest. When his last heartthrob was announced, it seemed as if for the moment the heart of the world stood still. Waiting was followed by weeping. As the sad news was flashed from shore to shore, and under the sea, and around the world, ruler and ruled in every land felt that earth was the poorer for his death, as it had been the richer for his life. The nation which he had saved and ruled, and which he had represented and honored, claimed the privilege of guarding his worn body until it could reverently and with tenderness lay it in its final resting place. In distant lands, men met in mourning assemblages to share each other's sorrow, and to honor themselves in giving honor to his memory. At a special memorial service in Westminster Abbey, the great of Great Britain thronged that pantheon of our race to show to each other and to the world how highly he was esteemed, and how greatly he was loved. General Grant died at Mount McGregor, New York, July 23, 1885. United States soldiers and veterans of his old command guarded his body there, and on August 6 escorted it on its way through watching thousands at every stage of its progress to New York, where it lay in state in the city's care, while 250,000 of mourning citizens passed in line to gaze reverently on that loved face, more impassible now than ever, until, 2 days later, it was borne to its tomb with such a pageant as never before honored an American citizen, while 1,000,000 people, as representative of 60 millions, walked or watched in loving sorrow. At least 500,000 people were added on that memorable day to the 1,000,000 and more already in New York City. All business was suspended. Traffic and travel were intermitted. Along the route from the City Hall to Riverside Park, fully 7 miles, the way was lined with sympathetic mourners. On the sidewalks, at windows and doors, on the roofs, and on ascending platforms at every opening and square, large or small, the people gazed reverently as the great procession slowly moved on. There was no excitement, no show of disturbance, not even any loud talking. A quiet and solemn hush prevailed. Faces were sad, and many eyes were moist. Consciousness of a great loss pervaded the vast assemblage, and all felt that it was good to have lived under the immediate influence of such a life, as he whom all mourned had lived for them all. On an imposing catafalque, drawn by 24 black horses, rested the coffin, covered by a purple velvet pall. The greatest and the best in our land followed that body to the tomb, accompanied by a military and a civic procession of at least 3 miles in length. President and ex-presidents, justices of our Supreme Court, senators and members of Congress, ambassadors from foreign courts, governors of states, Army and Navy officers of the highest grade, representative clergymen of every denomination, Christian and Jewish, veterans of the Civil War and of the Mexican War, officers and men who had fought against General Grant, as well as those who had fought with him and under him, citizens of every class or grade, from those of wealth and eminence to the humblest in our land. All were there, and all were mourners. Marching all the distance as a chaplain of the occasion, in conjunction with a department chaplain of the Grand Army of the Republic of Pennsylvania, just before the catafalque, I had occasion to note the deep solemnity and evident sympathy pervading that mighty concourse of mourners, as they fixed their eyes on the honored casket which bore the body of him who had centered the eyes of the world while he lived, and who was now the center of the world's loving thoughts. General Grant's evident greatness never seemed greater. A salute of guns from the naval vessels in the harbor marked the starting of the great procession. As it moved along its course, military bands, one after another, played a funeral dirge, the subdued notes of which fell gently on the ears of all. When, after 7 hours of marching, the procession entered Riverside Park, another salute from the Navy noted the approach of the closing scene. tens of thousands of mourning observers covered the adjacent hillsides. The afternoon sun shone softly across the waters of the Hudson, while minute guns were fired from the naval vessels on the river below the tomb, as the coffin was lifted reverently from its place on the catafalque and was rested near the tomb. As the designated bearers came from their carriages to perform their last sad ministry, it was seen that General William T. Sherman walked arm in arm with his friend and old antagonist, General Joseph E. Johnston, and that General Philip H. Sheridan was arm in arm with General Simon B. Buckner, whose unconditional surrender to General Grant first evidenced General Grant's power to the country. General John B. Gordon, Chief Lieutenant of General Lee, was serving for the day on the staff of General Winfield S. Hancock, who was in command of the funeral ceremonies. All felt then that at last dear General Grant's heartfelt prayer was answered. Let us have peace. Within the wonderful inner group gathered at that tomb, while the closing offices of reverent affection were being performed, the scene was impressive and oppressive to the last degree. Children and grandchildren of the dead hero were nearest. President Cleveland was there, ex-presidents Hayes and Arthur, foreign diplomats, chief officers of our Army and our Navy, government officials, and eminent citizens in every walk of life. Such an assemblage of the great and the good as never before was gathered at a grave on this continent. As the last words of prayer were spoken, and as a volley of musketry and guns from the Navy marked the last of earth, while all stood with bowed heads and throbbing hearts, an army bugler sounded the familiar call taps, closing with lights out. As the penetrating notes of that solemn bugle call died away, the pall of silence was on all. None seemed able to break it, or to move. The pause seemed an age. General Sherman, grim old hero as he was, realized the crisis. He broke the silence and the spell. With a quick motion of his extended hands, he said, "Our work is done." All were released. 12 years later, the American people joined once more in giving honor to the memory of the great commander, as his body was removed from its temporary resting place to the splendid granite tomb erected nearby, through a nation's gratitude, for its permanent earthly rest. On April 27, 1897, the 75th anniversary of General Grant's birth, 500,000 of citizens from outside of New York, together with the nearly 2 millions of its own population, were united as in a common love and a common sorrow to pay another tribute of respect to his honored memory. The President of the United States was there, to make by his presence and words the occasion one of national import. Governors of states, north and south, east and west, officials and dignitaries, with representatives of foreign governments, more than 50,000 soldiers, including regular troops and citizen soldiery, veterans of the Civil War from both the Union and Confederate armies. While on the Hudson River, in sight from the tomb, were war vessels of our American Navy, and others of England, France, Spain, and Italy. It was like the funeral ceremony repeated, with the added impressiveness of the universal conviction that the passage of years only brought out more and more distinctly the greatness of General Grant as a soldier and a man, and the depth and permanency of the nation's gratitude to him. Again, it was my privilege to bear a part in the closing tribute of the day's ceremonies, by being one of a detail of the Grand Army Post of which General Grant was a member, to lay a wreath with these loving words at the door of his tomb, and to utter words of prayer for God's blessing on the lessons of his life to those who have survived him. With the placing of this memorial tribute, comrades, our service for General Grant is at an end. But his service for us and for our country still goes on. While this granite structure stands, and so long as our country endures, his life story will be a lesson and an inspiration to the citizens of the great republic which he saved and served. It is enough for us that we were of the mighty host by which he was enabled to do his work, and that we may strive and hope to be of that multitude which no man can number, who shall gather finally in the presence of the Captain of his salvation, whom he served and trusted, and whom we may trust and serve forevermore. It is a high privilege to have been in touch, in any way, with the personality and career of such a man as General Grant. It ought to prove a high inspiration. End of section 36. Section 37 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 13. Linkings with the Navy. During our Civil War, Army and Navy were as one force in restoring the supremacy of the federal authority. The two arms of service co-worked harmoniously and with efficiency toward the one end. While the power of the Navy was felt for good by all who were in the Union Army anywhere, those soldiers whose field of service was along our Atlantic or Gulf Coast, or in the vicinity of our great rivers, had occasion to rely on the Navy more consciously than those who served only at a distance from navigable waters. General Grant relied on Admirals Foote and Farragut and Porter for the carrying out of his best laid plans of Army occupation at important points, from his early operations against Forts Henry and Donelson, and against Vicksburg in the southwest, to his final capture of Fort Fisher on the Atlantic coast. New Orleans and Mobile Bay and Port Royal and Fort Pulaski were captured and made available as bases of military operations, through the brilliant strategy and the splendid daring of Admirals Farragut and DuPont in cooperation with Generals Butler and Mitchell, and Benham and Seymour, and Gilmore and Terry, and other Army commanders. Neither Army nor Navy could say to the other, at any period in our Civil War, "I have no need of thee." My regiment went out originally in General Burnside's Coast Division, which was to cooperate with Commodore Goldsborough's command for the capture of Roanoke Island and New Bern, and Army and Navy were as one force in all the movements in North Carolina. Later the regiment was on the Sea Islands of the South Carolina coast, under Generals Hunter, Gilmore, and Terry, in operations against Charleston. There, we of the Army came to rely more and more on the Navy for opening the way for our landing, for protecting our flanks when we moved forward, and for adding force to every movement in attack or defense. Memories of particular war experiences in which the Navy bore an important part are vivid in our soldier minds today. For instance, our brigade was ordered to take possession of Seabrook Island, in the waters of South Carolina, in the early spring of 1863. Moving along the coast in a steamer transport, by night, from Port Royal Harbor, we found ourselves in the early morning in North Edisto Inlet, just off the shores of Seabrook Island. The island was covered by a dense southern forest of typical luxuriance. It was still occupied by the enemy, prepared to oppose its occupancy by our soldiers. We were ordered to land a small force on the sandy beach at the lower end, and move up the island through the forest to a suitable position for an entrenched line. 5 launches containing 100 men each comprised our landing force. Knowing that the enemy under cover would naturally attack us while we were landing, before we were in line to defend ourselves, we realized that the movement was one of no small peril. Then it was that our main hope of protection was in the 2 monitors and a gunboat covering our advance and protecting our flanks with the explosions of their mammoth shells. As they opened fire on the woods near the beach, we felt that a feasible way was opened for our landing. Under cover of their thunderous artillery, our launches pulled toward the beach. That naval cannonade was inspiring music to us, and a leader in our foremost boat struck up the John Brown chorus, which 500 soldier voices joined in with a will. The landing was effected safely, and the march to the upper end of the island was made with slight opposition. For months after that we occupied that island with a feeling of security, in spite of every effort to dislodge us. We had confidence because of the fleet of ironclads in the inlet, under the immediate direction of Commander George W. Rogers, of the Monitor Catskill. On more than one occasion, when the enemy came down, we were enabled to maintain our position on the island with the help of the cooperating Navy. Again in July 1863, we were ordered to James Island under General Terry to make an offensive demonstration in cooperation with General Gillmore's advance against Charleston by way of Folly Island and Morris Island. On the night of July 15, we were on picket at the upper end of the island. The left of the line, held by our regiment, rested on the shore, its flank being protected by the Pawnee and a small gunboat. The right of our picket line, which was refused considerably in the alignment, was held by Colonel Robert G. Shaw's 54th Massachusetts Regiment of colored soldiers, now for the first time at the extreme front, and as yet untested in battle. A reconnaissance had been made along our line by a small force of the enemy's cavalry the preceding afternoon. During the night there was a heavy rain, and there was an opportunity, under cover of the storm and darkness, for offensive preparation by the enemy. About dawn of July 16, the storm cleared off, and a sharp attack was made on the right of our line by the enemy in force. The purpose was evident: to break through the line of colored pickets and thus flank and overpower our regiments at the left. But the colored soldiers stood their ground bravely, and only fell back slowly, skirmishing as they yielded their ground foot by foot under the pressure of a greatly superior force, thus enabling the left of the line to fall back to a position for a permanent stand. It was a thrilling sight that morning. Cavalry, infantry, artillery, and a naval force, all engaged at the same time, within the sweep of a watcher's eye, in the reddening dawn of the eastern sky above that field. The attack by the enemy was simultaneous all along our lines. In front of our left, the enemy had brought down and masked a battery during the night to engage the United States steamer Pawnee and the gunboat Marblehead, lying near the shore for our protection. And the first notice of this the Pawnee received was its rapid shots crashing into her wooden sides before she could be swung around and dropped downstream to a position where she could bring her heavy guns to bear on the attacking battery. When these guns opened fire, they soon silenced those of their opponent, but not until the Pawnee had been struck 42 times. A government steamer in the river at our right did good service with her guns against the enemy's lines in that direction, and one of our gunboats beyond Secessionville opened a vigorous fire on the enemy's rear. We realized that morning, as at many another time, how important was the cooperation of the Navy with the Army, as enabling our bravest soldiers to do their best work in an emergency, and to have success at a critical time. It was much the same while we were in Virginia, at Gloucester Point, and on the banks of the Appomattox or of the James, at Bermuda Hundreds, or before Petersburg or Richmond. We were never at a distance from the Navy, from the opening to the close of our term of service. Yet while we were thus linked with the Navy in all our service in the Army, and while we had reason to recognize the exceeding value of this cooperation of the two branches of service in their work to a common end, it cannot be truly said that at that time we rightly estimated the importance and power of the Navy in serving and saving our country in its supreme crisis. It is unquestionably true that the magnitude of our armies and the sanguinary nature of land engagements in our Civil War gave for the time a disproportionate prominence to the military arm of service, in contrast with the naval, in the work of reestablishing our national authority. Gradually, however, it has come to be recognized that the world learned more from our naval achievements on river and coast and on the high seas in that war than from all that was done by our land forces. Our military successes were not unparalleled. Our naval successes were. So impartial an observer as the Edinburgh Review said on this point, soon after our war closed. The important part borne by the American Navy in the contest, the powerful share taken by it in the river campaigns which cut the seceded states in twain, the vast weight due to its exertions in the final successes of the Federal generals, have been but little noticed as compared to the din and shock of the great battles with which the New World rang. Yet nothing is more surprising in this great contest. No military, political, or financial success has more completely defied expectation, prophecy, and precedent than the work wrought by this arm of the Union forces, and wrought by it in the very process of creation out of actual nonentity. DuPont, whirling his vessels around the battle ellipse at Port Royal, and battering into submissive ruins in 4 hours such earthworks as stood a siege of months from the foremost engineers of the Old World at Sevastopol. Foote, resistlessly sweeping up and down the Mississippi and its tributaries with his motley fleet of unique craft, making havoc with his foes on shore and stream 6 days in the week, and on the 7th standing in some riverside church, or on his quarter-deck, the earnest and eloquent preacher of the gospel of Christ. Farragut, even by British critics, confessed the first seaman of the age, moving his mighty fleet at New Orleans through the grim gauntlet of commanding forts at dead of night by the light of flashing guns and blazing rafts, bursting through river booms, scattering hostile gunboats, sinking armored rams, eluding burning barges, and silencing shore batteries, to bring the Crescent City in surrender at his lieutenant's feet. Or again, as he stood in the Hartford's rigging at Mobile Bay, handling his squadron of monitors in cavalry tactics against the Leviathan Tennessee and its attendant minor sea monsters. David D. Porter, in all his brilliant service from the relief of beleaguered Fort Pickens in the very opening scenes of the war, down to his magnificent fight at Fort Fisher as the closing acts of the bloody drama. Jack Rogers, in his lightning-like destruction of the supposed invincible Atlanta, in presence of the gaily bedecked fleet of merry-making civilians from Savannah, with his subsequent hearty offer to his complaining prisoner to take back his huge ironclad and try the fight over again if one thrashing were not enough for him. Young Cushing, Phil Sheridan of the seas, raiding audaciously through the enemy's lines to destroy single-handed the dreaded ram Albemarle under the guns and watch of a vigilant and strong-armed foe, and performing a half-score of similar feats of daring, either of which might have made a world-wide hero of that beardless boy. Morris, going down with the grand old Cumberland, sinking but not surrendering, firing his farewell broadside of defiance as his vessel settled calmly into her grave of glory, with the dear old flag still flying at her peak. Worden, coming up in the puny cheese-box Monitor, like the stripling David, to beard and vanquish the defiant Goliath of the deep. Boggs, selling so dearly the life of the vessel Varuna at the Mississippi's mouth. Samson-like, carrying with him to destruction the Philistine host of gunboats. Winslow, fighting the decisive nautical duel with the representative freebooter of the seas, in the presence of its scowling seconds, the liberty-hating aristocracies of England and France. Aye, and plain John Davis, the Valley City gunner, throwing his body across the open barrel of powder to protect the magazine from fire in the waters of North Carolina. And Frisbee, gunner's mate on the Pinola, when the berth deck was on fire, closing the magazine against the flames, himself remaining inside. These starred names, with a countless host of their gallant fellows, famous or unknown, who dared and endured and suffered in the long months of dreary watching along 3,000 miles of embargoed coast, in the perilous scouts of huge launches, or of swift-flying gigs within the enemy's closest harbor defenses, in the and in the ever-present danger from submerged torpedoes, or suddenly descending rams, or coast and ocean storms, or who went down in a moment to a sailor's living grave, as in the original Monitor, the Housatonic, the Weehawken, and the Tecumseh. Are not they worthy of ever-fresh remembrance among the noblest and bravest defenders of our Republic? Shall they not be borne always gratefully in mind, for what they did and for what they were, while heroism and unselfish devotion to country are held in honor by those who reap the fruits of their patriotic daring? End of section 37. Section 38 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 13, Part 2. As a hearty tribute of respect for the ability and worth of the many officers of our Navy whom I have known personally, I wish to tell of 4 of these, of widely different characteristics, yet each one the representative of a class, with whom I was brought into somewhat intimate relations in a Southern prison, or in active service on the Southern coast. First there was Lieutenant Benjamin H. Porter, Ben Porter as he was commonly called, an admirable specimen of the wide-awake, enthusiastic American sailor boy. For boy he was to the last, being barely 20 years old when he yielded his noble young life in the assaulting column at Fort Fisher, after 4 years of active naval service. When about 15, young Porter was appointed to the Naval Academy at Annapolis, from Lockport, New York. This was in 1859, before the first mutterings were heard of the coming storm of civil war. Little thought had he of what was really before him. "Just think of my being here," he wrote, "going to school, and the government paying me $30 a month for my company. Ain't it bunkum?" The government had the worth of its money from that schoolboy before it was through with him. At the opening of the year 1861, Porter was joyous in the thought of his first vacation. His new uniform was a delight to him, and he had a boyish pride in the thought of showing it off before his home neighbors. His letters of that period showed him utterly free from any forebodings of national peril, or any anticipations of the weighty responsibilities so soon to rest on him. "Last Saturday," he wrote about this time, "I sent one of the servants out into town to get some oysters. After taps at night, we got out our chafing dish, crackers, butter, pepper, and salt. I got down under my bed, and took the chafing dish with me. After all was ready, P and H hauled down the bedclothes over the front part of the bed, so the light could not reflect from the opposite wall out of the window. Everything being ready, I struck the light and lay down on the floor to wait for the oysters to cook. After they were cooked, we drew the table up to the window, and then commenced the fun. We ate a quart this time, and, as soon as we had finished, we cooked another quart and ate them." It was while young Porter was thus fun-loving and careless, at Annapolis, that the storm cloud of civil war burst suddenly upon our country. Beautifully then did he illustrate the change which seemed to transform the people of the loyal North. As by a single bound, he sprang from light-hearted boyishness to a mature young manhood, ready for the severest patriot service. No more talk of home leave and gold lace. No more time wasted in student frolics. "I suppose you have heard before this that civil war has commenced," he wrote home on the dark 14th of April. "Fort Sumter has been taken. I think that the Secretary of the Navy will graduate the first class immediately, and that the third and fourth classes will go on leave. I think I shall apply to be sent down to the Gulf if my class goes on leave. I have sworn to stand by the glorious Stars and Stripes, and just as long as there is a star left, I will fight for it. Nobly did the young hero fulfill the spirit of that pledge. Porter's first service was as midshipman on the Roanoke, on blockade duty off the Atlantic coast. That was dull work for him, and he was glad enough when his petition for a share in the then fitting Burnside expedition was favorably received, and he was put in command of 6 launches, with a battery of Dahlgren howitzers and 150 men. At the Battle of Roanoke Island, Midshipman Porter's battery was in position on land, with the Army's extreme advance. In that fight, one of the sharpest of the war for the numbers engaged, that boy of 17 stood at his guns, under a destructive fire, inspiring his men by his magnetic presence and irrepressible enthusiasm, and doing eminent execution by the fire he directed. Admiral Goldsborough, Commodore Marston, and Generals Burnside and Foster commended his admirable conduct as deserving of the highest praise, and as having not only contributed largely to the success of the day, but won the admiration of all who witnessed the display. After this battle, young Porter was assigned, as an acting master, to the command of the gunboat Ellis, on duty in the North Carolina waters. Not yet 18, with such a responsible command. He had an active part in the reduction of Fort Maegan. In the fall of 1862, on his promotion as ensign, he was ordered to report to Admiral DuPont at Port Royal. After several months of blockading service, he was, in the summer of 1863, selected by Admiral Dahlgren to explore Charleston Harbor and learn its obstructions and channel ways. This was a difficult and delicate task, requiring judgment and caution, as well as energy and daring. The work must be done by night, in the face of dangers from sunken torpedoes and from an ever-watchful enemy. For 24 consecutive nights, that 18-year-old boy was on this service, while during 16 of the intervening days his vessel was in action and he on duty there. Night after night he groped his way in the darkness among the harbor obstructions, and day after day he was active on his ship's gun deck. He found the passageway of the blockade runners, passed the enemy's forts again and again, and actually skirted the wharves of the city of Charleston. On one occasion, when a boat from the fleet was run down by the Confederate steamer Alice, that daring and chivalrous boy flashed his lights and rescued 8 of the drowning men, although thereby making himself the target of guns from land and sea. It is not to be wondered at that, such was the strain of this service on his nervous system. The brave young ensign would at times be so exhausted on his return to his ship that his men must lift him from the boat, and his loss of flesh was a pound a day during the more than 3 weeks of this venturesome scouting. For a night attack on Fort Sumter, in September 1863, Ensign Porter volunteered to join a scaling party, and was taken prisoner with the few other officers who were brave enough to persevere in the assault after most of the boats had been driven from the scene. Carried first to Charleston, he was soon sent up to Columbia, and it was there that I was his fellow prisoner for several months. Prison life was more trying to young Porter than scouting in Charleston Harbor had been, but he submitted to it as cheerfully as he did to every other privation or trial in the line of duty. He had 14 months in prison. A part of the time he was in irons as one of the hostages for 2 Confederate privateersmen, who were held by our government as pirates. Once he aided in digging a tunnel under the jail building in the hope of escape. But the plan was frustrated, through treachery, just on the eve of its realization. The boy side of Porter's nature showed itself in prison as elsewhere. He was the life of the party. He was always taking a cheery view of the situation. If at times he would seem to give way under the heavy pressure, and would stand in the jail window with his fair young face pressed against the bars, evidently longing for liberty, the first call of a comrade would bring him back to his wonted joyousness, and he would spring to the floor with a hopeful word, and perhaps follow a joking sentence with his contagious laugh. In a room of the jail adjoining that of the naval officers, there was confined in irons a Captain Harris, of Tennessee, held as a hostage for some Confederate prisoner, under special charges. It was a delight of Ben Porter to put his mouth to the keyhole of the door and whistle a lively tune, while the captain danced to it with the accompanying clanking of his chains. After Porter had been himself in irons, he taught Captain Harris how to remove and replace his handcuffs and fetters without the knowledge of the prison officials. It was through this instruction that Captain Harris's life was saved when the Columbia jail was burned, early in 1865. At last Porter was out of prison. Passing his examination for promotion before a special board at Washington, he was commissioned as lieutenant, to rank from the month when he was 19 years old. He was then, early in 1865, ordered to report to Admiral Porter at Hampton Roads. By the Admiral, he was put in command of the Malvern, flagship of the squadron. A high honor for a boy of his years, but an honor well deserved. At the second attack on Fort Fisher, Lieutenant Porter led an assaulting party on the beach against the sea face of the fort, and fell at the head of his men. He died as he had lived, bravely and unselfishly doing his duty. He had lived the life of only a boy in years. He had shown the spirit and done the work of the manliest and maturest of men. His life was one of high achievement and of yet higher promise. Ben Porter's character and record are typical of some of the choicest specimens of American naval officers, of those who began to do great things in boyhood and continued to do better and greater things throughout their lives, of the Perrys and Rogerses and McDonoughs and Farragut's and Porters, and others like them. Of this young officer Admiral Porter said he was the most splendid fellow I ever knew, my beau ideal of an officer. And his classmate Cushing added, I have never known an officer more truly loved and admired, and justly too, for the earth contained few like him. Dear Ben Porter, his memory will never pass from the minds of those who knew his attractiveness and worth. The second naval officer to whose characteristics I would call attention was Lieutenant S.W. Preston, who, although somewhat older than Ben Porter, was with him for a time in the Naval Academy, was his companion in imprisonment, and fell by his side at Fort Fisher. Preston was preeminently the courtly officer, the gentleman sailor. Not that his comrades were lacking in gentlemanly qualities, but that he was distinguished even among them for his courtliness, his gracefulness, and his remarkable native refinement of person and manner. Entering the Naval Academy from Illinois, Preston went thence into active service at the outbreak of the Civil War. He was on duty as midshipman and ensign until August 1862, when he was promoted lieutenant. His ability was everywhere recognized, and his character and bearing invariably commanded respect and admiration. Under Admiral Dahlgren, in the first attack on Charleston, young Preston was flag lieutenant of the Wabash. Afterwards, he was on duty for a time on the new Ironsides. End of section 38. Section 39 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 13, Part 3. In the bold attempt by Admiral Dahlgren to carry Fort Sumter by storm, in September 1863, Lieutenant Preston volunteered to lead a division of the scaling party. He was one of the first to land, and he bore himself most gallantly through the brief but sharp contest that resulted in his capture with the remnant of the vanquished party. With Ben Porter he was sent from Charleston to Columbia. It was there that I met the two together. My first impression of Lieutenant Preston was in the line of his typical character. The naval officers were brought into the jail during the night. When we of the Army were permitted to go into the yard for our morning exercise, we found the newcomers there. Preston I remember seeing at the hydrant, washing. His clear complexion, fine features, intelligent face, and bared chest, his skin fair as a woman's, stamped him as a gentleman of unusual delicacy and refinement. I was drawn to him from the start. Then we were shut up together for months, and I learned to admire him more and more. He was a man of cultivated tastes and faculties, well read and well informed. He had a poetic mind, with a transcendental turn, and a love of the mystical. Nor did he neglect special studies in science and languages during his long imprisonment. He was a fine conversationalist. He had a high sense of honor and a sensitive conscience. And he was remarkably pure in thought and speech. There was withal a love of adventure and a touch of romance in his nature that, with his other qualities, would have fitted him for a prominent place in the age of chivalry. During his imprisonment, his handsome face attracted attention at the jail windows, looking out on the public square of the Palmetto State Capitol. And a love affair was the result, one which by itself would form the substantial basis of a glowing poem or a thrilling novel. There were all the desired accessories: the imprisoned brave and handsome hero, the wealthy and beautiful young lady, the clandestine correspondence, the bribed guards, the temporary release of the young officer, the midnight meeting and the plighted troth, the hero's return to captivity, his final release from imprisonment, and his death in the battle's front before the nuptials could be celebrated. That picture of life and love stood out in bright colors against the dark background of prison gloom before those who were fellow captives in Columbia, and it is told and retold among the survivors today. After 14 months of imprisonment, Preston was again at liberty. Refusing a proffered leave of absence, he was assigned to duty with the North Atlantic Squadron, and became Admiral Porter's flag lieutenant on the Malvern. In the second attack on Fort Fisher, he went on shore with the storming party, and had charge of an entrenching force in advance of the main column moving against the sea face of the fort. He went into action in full uniform, in accordance with the traditional etiquette of the Navy, and was consequently a conspicuous mark for the enemy's sharpshooters. The special service assigned to him in this action was completed, and just as he had reported his work finished, and asked of his commanding officer what further duty he could perform, he fell mortally wounded. He was the courtly gentleman to the last. As I was told by a comrade who lay near him, when Preston found that he was dying, he turned himself on his back on the beach, straightened out his handsome form to the full, reached up his arms, and, with both hands carefully gathered under his head, the soft sand and a tuft or two of the shore grass, as a supporting pillow, then folded his arms with his gloved hands across his chest, and composed himself to die. Although Porter and Preston are named by me as illustrating different types of the naval officer, they had much in common in their characters, as they had in their experiences. Their common qualities are well brought out in the tribute to their memory by Fleet Captain Breese, in his official report of their death to Admiral Porter. He says of them, "Preston, after accomplishing most splendidly the work assigned him by you, which was both dangerous and laborious, under constant fire, came to me, as my aide, for orders, showing no flagging of spirit or body, and, returning from the rear, whither he had been sent, fell, among the foremost at the front, as he had lived, the thorough embodiment of a United States officer." Porter, conspicuous by his figure and uniform, as well as by his great gallantry, claimed the right to lead the headmost column, with the Malvern's men he had taken with him, carrying your flag, and fell at its very head. Two more noble spirits the world never saw, nor had the Navy ever two more intrepid men. young, talented, and handsome, the bravest of the brave, pure in their lives, surely their names deserve something more than a passing mention, and are worthy to be handed down to posterity with the greatest and best of naval heroes. I must speak of their singleness of purpose to do their whole duty, always cheerful and willing, desirous of undertaking anything which might redound to the credit of the service, combining with their intelligence a ready perception as to the best mode of accomplishing their orders. Quite a different person from either Porter or Preston, yet well known to and respected by both, was Commander E.P. Williams, familiarly called Barney Williams. He was a good specimen of the genuine sailor, of the duty-loving follower of the sea, one of that sort of men who, under the lead of its officers of genius and brilliancy, have given a substantial character to the United States Navy in all its honored history. Williams was from Castine, Maine, a region of hardy sailors. From his entrance into the Navy to the opening of our Civil War, he was most of the time on sea duty. In the Indian Ocean, on the coast of Africa, along the shores of Brazil, and in the Paraguay expedition, he served with credit, growing in the confidence of his superiors. For a short time he was on duty at the Naval Academy. Early in the war he was doing efficient service in the South Atlantic Squadron, in command of the steam gunboat Paul Jones. He had a lively engagement with the enemy at St. John's Bluff, in Florida, and made a venturesome run up the St. John's River to Enterprise. Off Morris Island, he had a sharp contest with the Confederate ram Chicora, while seeking to draw off the enemy from the wreck of our double-turreted monitor Keokuk. In September 1863, Williams was in command of a division of the assaulting column in the night attack from the Navy on Fort Sumter. He there bore himself most gallantly, and his subsequent feeling was that had he been well supported by his entire force, the move would have been successful. He was taken prisoner at the same time with Porter and Preston, who were his juniors, and with them he came to Columbia. In prison he was the ranking naval officer, and as such was looked up to with respect by his comrades. His characteristics stood out there as elsewhere. He chafed less in confinement than some others. He adapted himself more easily to the situation. The prevailing desire in his mind was not a love of adventure, nor a wish for promotion and renown. It was to do a sailor's duty wherever his lot was cast. Hence he could be more contented in prison when he must be there. There was, moreover, a genial heartiness about the man which attached his friends to him warmly. He did much to make the prison life endurable to others, and he is remembered most pleasantly by his Richland jail companions. He naturally longed for liberty, and he was engaged in more than one unsuccessful plan of escape. He had a most trying experience while held in irons for several months as one of the hostages for Beale and McGuire, who were on trial for piracy. Yet even this he could stand better than young Porter, who was his companion in it all. When, after 14 months of imprisonment, Williams, with his brother officers, was again at liberty, he had no such brilliant service, nor such a tragic end in battle, as gives point to the story of Preston and Porter. He survived the war, and after it was all over, I more than once recalled with him its varied and thrilling experiences as I visited him in his Roxbury home, or at his office at the Naval Rendezvous in Boston. Yet Commander Williams died a sailor's death, died as bravely and as grandly as either of his prison comrades, died a death which entitles his memory to love and honor from all. It was on the afternoon of January 24, 1870, that Williams, in command of the sloop of war Oneida, left the port of Yokohama, Japan, to return to the United States after a 3 years' cruise. When 15 miles from port, in the Bay of Yedo, after the darkness of night had shut in, the Oneida was run into by the British mail steamer Bombay, bound for Yokohama, and cut down to the water's edge. Commander Williams was in his cabin at the time. He was in a reclining chair, having fallen asleep, perhaps to dream of home, when the shock of the collision came, and he was thrown violently to the cabin floor, while the water rushed in upon him, and the sounds of confusion were heard on the deck above. In an instant he was on deck, as calm and collected as if nothing unusual demanded attention. Seeing the lights of the moving steamer which had done the foul deed, he at once comprehended the situation. "I told him," says one of his surviving officers, "that the ship had ported her helm and cut us down." "I know it, sir," he quietly replied, and, with the sailor's instinct, added, "Let us save the ship." But the ship was not to be saved. His executive officer came up and reported, "Captain, we shall sink by the stern in 3 minutes," urging him at the same time to take at once to one of the 2 remaining boats. His own safety was not, however, the thought of Commander Williams at such a time as that. There were 24 officers and 152 men on that vessel, and he was responsible for them all. He would not desert his ship while they were on it in peril. "I saw him," said one of his sailors, "on the port side of the bridge, one hand resting on the iron rail of the bridge, and the other on the gunwale of the first cutter. I said to him, 'Captain, you had better get into this boat.' And he answered me, 'Never mind me. I will go down with the ship. You stay in the boat.' And there unmoved he stood at the post of duty, even when standing there took him under 40 fathoms of water. 21 officers and 95 men went with him to the bottom. There was no scramble for places of safety, no neglect of discipline. Those who left the ship did so under orders. Those who went down with it were where for the time they belonged." End of section 39. Section 40 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 13, Conclusion. It was no false pride, no undue sensitiveness to his reputation, which made Commander Williams ready to sink with his ship. His life was a life of duty, a sailor's duty, duty to his vessel, duty to his flag, duty to his country. His death was consistent with his life. It is examples like his that make discipline and coolness and heroic unselfishness possible in such a scene of disaster on the seas, and that secure the safety of many who would otherwise be lost, and the honor of those who perish. How much better it is to thus conform to the scriptural duty of being faithful unto death, than to heed the godless suggestion that self-preservation is the first law of nature. Fourth on the list of naval officers, whose memories I am now recalling, and chief of all, comes Captain George W. Rogers. He stands out in my mind as distinctively the Christian officer, a naval Havelock or Hedley Vickers. Yet he combined the choicest qualities of the other 3 officers of whom I have told. Like Ben Porter, as a youth George Rogers had gallantry, attractiveness, and promise. He was, like Preston, a refined and polished gentleman. No less than Williams was he the skilled and duty-loving seaman. And over and above all, he was the pronounced and consistent Christian, whose sincerity and earnestness in the service of the captain of our salvation were recognized by all who knew him. George Rogers was, as it were, born into the Navy. He was the son of Commodore George W. Rogers, who for his services in the War of 1812 received a sword from his native state, and from Congress a gold medal and a vote of thanks. A nephew of Commodore John Rogers, who fired the first gun of that war, and was for some years senior officer of our Navy. A cousin of Admiral John Rogers, and a brother of Admiral C. Raymond Rogers, this on his father's side. His mother was a daughter of the first Commodore Perry, a sister of Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, of Lake Erie fame, of Commodore M.C. Perry, who opened Japan to our commerce, of the 2 young Perrys who commanded under Macdonough at Lake Champlain, and of Ensign Alexander Perry, who at 10 years old served so bravely at Lake Erie as to win the thanks of Congress and a Sword of Honor. In Army service his grandfather was Colonel Rogers, who commanded the Maryland line in the Revolutionary War. An uncle was Colonel Robert Rogers, of the 3rd Massachusetts Infantry in our Civil War. One of his brothers was Lieutenant Alexander Rogers, who fell at Chapultepec. Another brother was for a time in the Quartermaster's Department. And a brother-in-law, Lieutenant Smith, went down in mid-ocean in command of troops on the San Francisco. Thus George Rogers seemed predestined to the United States service, and by his own free will he was in the Navy from boyhood, entering it before he was 14 years old. It is unnecessary here to speak of the varied service to which he was called before our Civil War, the opening of which found him an instructor at the Naval Academy at Annapolis, giving the impress of his character and spirit to the young men like Preston and Porter and Cushing, who were there preparing for a greater work than they yet suspected. My purpose is to speak of him in his distinctive characteristics, as I saw them during my intercourse with him in the latter months of his life. I had known George Rogers in his mother's home, in the days of my boyhood. In wartime I first met him again in the waters of South Carolina, in the spring of 1863, where he was in command of the fleet of ironclads in North Edisto Inlet. My regiment, as I have already said, was then on duty at Seabrook Island. He called on me there, and invited me to visit him on his vessel, the Monitor Catskill. On the occasion of my first dining with him, I was impressed with the symmetry of his Christian character. Our only companion at table was my tent mate and loved friend, Adjutant Camp, the knightly soldier. As we 3 sat together, the steward brought wine to us. The adjutant and I declined it. "Would you like a lighter wine than this?" asked Commander Rogers. "Thank you, no," was the reply from each of us. "Do neither of you drink wine?" "Neither of us." "Then, steward, you can remove the wine," he said. "I have not used wine for 20 years." Strictly abstemious himself, he did not force his views upon others. It was only when he found that we 3 were in accord on this point that he told of his practice of total abstinence. Then, in the freedom of after-dinner chat, he spoke of his interest in the religious welfare of his men. He had already invited me to come, when I could, and preach on his vessel on a Sunday, or on a weekday evening. I now learned that, while an Episcopalian, and accustomed to the more formal services of that communion, he would leave his cabin of a Sunday evening, and, despite the barrier which necessarily separates officers and men in the discipline of a man of war, would lead a social prayer meeting among the men of his command. Reading a portion of Scripture, he would make familiar comments on it, would lead in prayer and singing, and then would call on one and another of his godly sailors to take part in the meeting at their pleasure. As we talked together of such work as this, he raised a cushion from one of his cabin seats, and opened below it a locker stowed with religious books and papers, of which he kept a supply for distribution among his men. The impressions of that first visit to his vessel were deepened in my mind by all our subsequent intercourse. I was frequently with him on ship and shore. He made an arrangement with my honored commander, General Tom Stevenson, to signal to him from headquarters when the church call notified a religious service in our camp. And he rarely failed of coming at once on shore for a part in the service. I had many delightful conversations with him, and latterly his increasing spirituality and interest in religious themes forced upon me a conviction that he was ripening for heaven. I had never seen anything of this nature so marked in one in full health. It was not a presentiment of death, for he apparently had no anticipation of his speedy decease. Neither was there gloom in his manner. He was always cheerful, and seemed thoroughly to enjoy life. But there was manifest in him a growing power of spirit over matter, and his face came to glow as with the preternatural light from the already opening gates of glory towards which his steps were trending. Again and again I spoke of this to my friend the adjutant. On the first Sunday in July, 1863, when Commander Rogers had been signaled of an approaching church service in our camp, he came hurriedly on shore to say that he had just received orders to coal up at once for a new move against Charleston, and he could not remain at the meeting as he wished to. As we stood together then for a few minutes, and he spoke with deep-toned earnestness of the duty of the hour, of the impending engagement, and of his regret at losing the privileges of worship that day, I was more than ever convinced that his days in this life were few. As he bade us good-bye, and I turned with my tent-mate towards our little rustic chapel, I said, "We shall never see George Rogers again on earth." In a few weeks the Army and Navy were cooperating actively against the defenses of Charleston. Adjutant Camp and I were prisoners of war, and George Rogers was thundering with his huge Dahlgrens against Wagner and Sumter and Moultrie. When, in August, he had been called to duty as Chief of Staff to Admiral Dahlgren, he obtained permission to continue in command of the Monitor Catskill during one more attack on the defenses of Charleston Harbor, before leaving his Monitor for his new place with the Admiral. It was while he was on this service, in advance of the rest of the fleet, that a huge shot from the fort struck the iron pilot-house in which he stood, and shivered a scale and bolt from its inner surface, killing him instantly. When I learned through the papers at my prison home in Columbia that a prominent officer, unnamed, had been killed on one of the Federal ironclads, I said to my friend the adjutant, "That is George Rogers." "You seem determined to kill him off," he replied. "Ah, but he was almost ready for translation when we left him." The correctness of my impression of his identity was verified when the captured naval officers from Fort Sumter brought the story of his death to Columbia. 6 years later, I found unlooked-for evidence that the remarkable change in the spirit and appearance of George Rogers was not a mere fancy of mine, but that it was noted by others as well. In a sketch of this gallant officer, Mr. William Swinton, a well-known war correspondent, who was with him for several weeks before his death, said, "Latterly there was seen in him a strange unworldliness that seemed to withdraw him from life, lifting him above the evils and confusions of this weary and unintelligible world. And there was that in his mood and manner which struck his friends with the sad premonition that he was not long to move among us." And Mr. Swinton told of looking out from his berth through the open stateroom door, and seeing Commander Rogers with his open Bible before him on the cabin table of the Catskill, or again upon his knees in prayer, and this for hour after hour through the night before his fatal move against Fort Sumter. It was not that George Rogers had any fear of death. It was rather that his fighting was now at an end, and he was drawing closer to him whom he served and trusted in peace and in war. Like the soldier apostle of old, he could say, "The time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day." And, while thus calmly expectant, he was not, for God took him. These 4 officers were types, each of a class. They represent the sort of men who have been in the United States Navy from its beginning, and who are still to be found there. The service which can develop such characters is worthy of honor from all. The country for which such men live and battle, and pray and die, may well have grateful pride in the heroism and devotedness of its faithful servants. End of section 40. Section 41 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 14. Seeing Slavery and Emancipation. One who reads history as the record of events and conditions and changes of long-gone times has knowledge of history in one way. One who lives through the events of a great national conflict and personally shares the excitements and fears and struggles and hopes that eventuate in a changed and improved national life that was never anticipated by the most sanguine of those actually in the conflict, or of those watching it from outside, knows history in quite another way. This difference is felt peculiarly by those who review the story of slavery as it was, and emancipation as it came to be, in this country within the last half-century. It is one thing to read that in 1861 there were 4 millions of human beings held in slavery in the United States of America, and that, as a consequence of excited discussion and embittered feeling over this subject, a fierce war between brethren was waged for more than 4 years from that time, at a cost of millions of lives and thousands of millions of dollars, resulting in the emancipation of all these slaves and a closer union of all these long estranged brethren. It is quite another thing to have lived through those prolonged preliminary discussions and excitements, while slavery was the present and seemingly the permanent cause of intensest bitterness, and to have shared the perils and hopes and despondencies while that fierce civil war was dragging its slow progress toward its hardly hoped for but blessed outcome. Only those who thus gained their knowledge of these pregnant events can rightly understand what they were and what they came to, but to them it is an ever-present and vivid reality. Slavery was formally abolished in my native state of Connecticut only 9 years before I was born. I remember old slaves in the vicinity of my early home who had been soldiers in the Revolutionary War and in the War of 1812, and who were now living comfortably and were well cared for. By the law of the state, their former owners were bound to provide for them as long as they lived, although they were absolutely free. Hence, while in early life I knew of slavery, I had no sense of its evils and no hostility to slaveholders as such. I knew that slavery still existed in the southern states, but I was taught that we at the North were no more responsible for it than for polygamy in Turkey. Quite a number of my acquaintances, and friends of my parents, had close business relations with the South, and some of them resided there a portion of every year. I admired the Christian character and the personal worth of some of these friends, and I had no occasion to be prejudiced against the South or its institutions from my early knowledge and associations. My father belonged to the old Whig party, and to that conservative portion of it later known as Silver-Gray Whigs, from its silver-haired leader, the Honorable Francis Granger of New York State. I had been given the name of Henry Clay of Kentucky from my father's sincere affection for the man and admiration for his political policy. I was brought up to love and revere the great commoner, who had saved our country from disunion in several critical emergencies by his successful advocacy of conciliatory compromises on the subject of slavery and its extension. I firmly believed that the existence and stability of our government rested on the sacredness of those compromises. Anti-slavery and abolition agitation had no sympathy for me, and in this feeling, up to 1854, I was like many another New England Whig, opposed to agitation at the North on the subject of slavery at the South, and zealous for all the constitutional rights of the South. But when, at that time, the attempt was made in Congress to violate the terms of what was deemed the sacred Missouri Compromise of 1820, and to overthrow our whole national basis of compromises, and carry slavery into territory inviolably pledged to freedom by South and North alike, the whole state of things was changed, and sympathies and feelings were swayed accordingly. Not from any feeling of hostility to the South, or even to the institution of slavery as such, but for the resistance of unfair slavery extension into the realm of freedom, I joined the newly formed Republican Party, and was on the stump, in 1856, for its candidates, Fremont and Dayton. I had been willing to let slavery in the South alone, but I was not willing to have slavery forced on me in the North. Then came the conflict on the plains of Kansas and Nebraska, preliminary skirmish of the Great Civil War, not for the purpose of interfering with slavery where it existed, but to retain at any cost free territory for freedom. I was personally acquainted with many of the Eastern men who went to Kansas as settlers with this conservative intention. I knew John Brown of Osawatomie, stern old Puritan that he was. I sat by him and heard him tell, on one of his visits to the East, of the fearful experiences, in Kansas, of himself and his companions, in conflict with slave state champions. He said nothing then of any purpose of his to attempt the overthrow of slavery, although it was but a few weeks before his final attempt at Harper's Ferry. But the glare in his eyes showed that he saw more than he was telling, and, although I had no sympathy with him in his special purpose as disclosed later, I could not wonder that his brain had been fired, and his whole soul aroused to the determination of rising up, alone as it were, to attempt the overthrow of the accursed system which had wrought all this wrong, and which was entrenched within the traditions of centuries and defended by all the power of a mighty national government, and he but one man, with God, in the conflict. Conservative men of New England generally, while having no personal bitterness toward Southerners, and while unwilling to act with those who advocated the direct abolition of slavery in the South, were from that time less inclined to apologize for slavery, and they grew more impatient of such apologies. Being in Boston one Sunday, I met at church an old Whig whom I was surprised to see just there, as he had been an active member in another denomination. "How's this?" I asked. "What are you doing here?" "Well, I'll tell you," he said. "Our pastor preached a sermon, a few months ago, in which he showed that slavery was a divine institution. He proved it, too. When I came out of church that noon, I said to my wife, 'Mary, our pastor has proved something today that we know is a lie. The next thing we know, he'll be proving something that we don't know is a lie. It is time we got out of this.' So we got out, and came over here." That process of thinking was going on all over New England among the most conservative. Those who saw anew that slavery would not be willing to let freedom alone began to ask themselves if slavery was really worthy of a place in comparison with freedom. A valued friend of mine with strong Southern sympathies, who had lived at the South for a number of years, was telling me that I would think better of slavery if I saw its bright side, as he had seen it. Questioning him about some of its details, I asked if it were true that in most of the slave states there were laws forbidding the slaves to be taught to read. He admitted that it was true. I asked if it were true that in such states of the Union the laws authorized the separation of families by slave owners, and that, in view of this fact, white clergymen there were accustomed to marry slave couples with a formal proviso looking to the possibility of such a separation, and a consequent sundering of the marriage tie, as though it were a providential ordering. He said that these things were so, but that they were inevitable in such a system, and that God-fearing masters were not responsible for them. "Well, if that be the case, my dear friend," I answered, "and the system of slavery requires that it be made a crime to teach one of God's children to read God's word, and also requires God's ministers to perform the marriage service with the distinct proviso that man may put asunder those whom God has joined together, don't you think that the system itself is, to speak mildly and reverently, a damnable system? I think it is." And that was my opinion before the war, yet I would not call myself an abolitionist. The election of Abraham Lincoln brought matters to a crisis. The time for discussion had passed. By special invitation, I had promised to pass a portion of the winter of 1860-61 in the city of New Orleans, in connection with Sunday School and Young Men's Christian Association interests. My host was a prominent citizen of New Orleans, a warm personal friend of Henry Clay. When the result of the presidential election was known, he wrote me a long letter, saying that of course it would not do for me to visit New Orleans as I had proposed, as social intercourse between the North and the South was now practically out of the question. Then he spoke bitterly of the Black Republican Party, and of his idea of its destructive purposes, closing with a challenge to me to point to any single verse in the entire Bible which distinctly forbade human slavery. I replied briefly that I realized that a visit to New Orleans just then would be impracticable, but that I did not care to discuss politics. As, however, he had challenged me to name a verse forbidding human slavery, I would answer frankly that I could not point to any verse in the Bible which, taken by itself, and in view of its context, squarely forbade slavery, polygamy, or wine drinking. Yet, on the other hand, I found no single verse expressly commanding any one of these practices. Therefore, as at present advised, as a matter of choice and in the exercise of a sound Christian discretion, I should have but one wife, no nigger, and drink cold water. Just after this came the arousing of the North by the bombardment of Fort Sumter, and the long war was open. Most of those who volunteered in defense of the government had no thought of the destruction of slavery. They were ready to do or to die for the reestablishing of national authority. But however they felt at the opening of the war, the relation of slavery and slaveholders to the federal government was totally changed by the new state of affairs. Slaves escaping through the lines northward were declared contraband of war, and therefore not to be restored to their hostile masters. Slavery came to be seen by the army as it actually was, instead of as it had been pictured by its defenders and apologists. The whole North was steadily educated to a higher standard on the slavery question. John Brown's body lay a-mouldering in the grave. His soul was marching on. One of my neighbors, an officer in the regiment of which I was later the chaplain, and in which I was his tent-mate and devoted friend, gave this incident from his early experiences in North Carolina, which greatly impressed me. I was in a Negro house yesterday, and had some conversation with the inmates. I asked one gray-haired old negress if she had ever had children sold away from her. "Sold? Dey all sold. Chillun and grandchillun and great-grandchillun, dey sell every one." She clasped her bony hands over her head, and looked up at me as she spoke. "There was one, de last one, de only grandchild I did hab lef. He neber knowed his mammy. I took him when he dat little. I bringed him up to massa, and I say, 'Massa, dis my little grandchild. May I keep him 'bout here?' And he say, 'I don't care what you do wid him.' So I take him. He dat little. Den one mornin', when he all rolled up in blanket 'tween my knees, Massa Green comed in, and say, 'Dis boy sold, and dey take him way. Oh, Lord Jesus, help me pray.'" End of section 41. Section 42 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 14, Part 2. Another conservative friend, an officer in that same regiment, wrote me, about the same time, of his experiences with the North Carolina slaves, in this way. "What shall I say of the darkies? These poor people, with whom we must now deal, for we cannot get rid of them. Every day they swarm in upon us, bringing strange stories of fright and flight on the part of their masters, and full of strange hopes and expectations for themselves. What words will describe that compound of cunning and simplicity, of mistrust and faith, of virtue and vice, of wisdom and folly, of which the Southern nigger is made? Here they are, all obsequiousness, all curiosity, and all expectation, full of wild dreams of deliverance, full of old traditions about the coming salvation, full of faith that their prayers are answered. They talk the 11th chapter of Daniel in a manner that shows that the prophet's words have been in their thoughts for many a long year. How many hours of sadness it has shortened, how many agonies it has allayed, how many yearnings for deliverance it has lightened with a gleam of hope, is known only to God. In the dark woods, where the long gray moss drapes the festoons of the wild vine, and hangs like the beard of age from the mammoth trees, black men have recited this chapter by the blazing fires, and have hoped. In plantation cabins, where the wrinkled beldam and the sooty infant bounded the extremes of a slave family, black eyes have wept tears of faith, and have prayed for a speedy fulfillment. And now they hail us as their deliverers. And in their presence, hearing their sad stories of suffering and wrong, knowing the degradation to which they were born, all the fine-spun theories, all the misty tissues of argument which have been about my eyes and have cobwebbed my brain, are swept away. And I see in its horrible reality this monster evil of our land and time. It was soon after this that the way was open for me to go to the war, as I had longed to, but as I had feared would never be possible, and I joined the 10th Connecticut Regiment at New Bern. Then for 3 years I had occasion to see for myself slavery as it was, and emancipation as it came to be, the one a cause and the other a result of that terrible conflict. Whether slaves were well treated or ill, whether their masters were kind and considerate or harsh and severe, a desire for liberty seemed to possess the slave heart, and all were ready to escape from bondage when and as they could, with the only exception of those who were unable to take their families with them, and were unwilling to leave them behind. This was true of the slaves as I saw them in North Carolina, in South Carolina, in Florida, in Virginia, and on the sea islands of the southern coast. When someone said to Mr. Lincoln that the slaves had no desire for emancipation, that as a class they were contented as they were, he replied that, if that were really so, it would furnish the best reason he had ever heard for thinking that they were unfit to be free. But the slaves whom I met, or of whom I heard, did not fail at this testing point. They were not satisfied with slavery. They all longed for liberty, and all were ready to grasp it when they could. On the first raid or dash of my regiment into the interior of North Carolina, in which I shared, after I joined my command, I met, at Little Washington, an intelligent and kind-hearted merchant, who told regretfully of his experience with his slaves. At the opening of the war, he had about 30 slaves, whom he prized and treated kindly. He went to New York to make purchases, leaving them on his place. Before he left, he had a free talk with them to promote their contentment. He assured them that if, in the progress of the war, other slaves were freed, they should be, and that at their emancipation he would give them a tract of 100 acres of land to settle on, where they could be as independent as they pleased. It was, he said to us, expensive keeping them, with times as they were, since they could not be used by himself or hired out to others to advantage. They were now only a burden to him financially, but he wanted to keep them for the pride of the thing. He bought, he said, several $100s worth of clothing for them in New York, but when he came back all but one of the slaves, and he an old one, had fled. A slave who was too old or too infirm to take care of himself was, it seemed, sometimes willing to be supported in slavery rather than to starve in freedom. In spite of the kindness of this man's heart, in spite of his generous provision for his slaves, in spite of his liberal promises to them for the future, in spite of his pride in their affection and his confidence in their contentment, almost without exception they had preferred present liberty, with its uncertainties and risks, to continued slavery, with all its high privileges and expectations. The man quite took this matter to heart, and it did look ungrateful, from his standpoint. But this was much the way with slaves generally. They streamed in at our picket lines, men, women, and children. They followed, on its return, every detachment of troops sent out on a hostile movement, or for purposes of observation. New Bern swarmed with them, and, the more there were there, the more others wanted to come in. Of course, many were doomed to disappointment in what they there found in freedom, but none were deterred from seeking it by what it brought, or what it failed to bring. On one occasion, a column of troops, under General Foster, moved out from New Bern, and up and across the country, for the purpose of burning some gunboats building for the Confederates, at Hamilton, on the Roanoke River. Slaves flocked to follow the column. Day by day their numbers grew, swelling to hundreds, women with infants in their arms, and little children, barefooted and scantily clad, tramping after them. They looked on the Union soldiers as their saviors, and freedom seemed to dawn just before them. It was hard to drive these poor creatures back into slavery again, and forbid their following the army, of which they asked nothing more than guidance to the Union lines. But it had to be done. The enemy were already in our rear. They supposed we were going back by the way we came, and they had effectually cut off our retreat by that route. General Foster had, however, ordered a sufficient number of transports to sail round from New Bern and meet him above Plymouth to carry his army back by water, and at the close of the day we hurried across the country to board these transports and put out into Albemarle Sound under cover of the night. There was barely transport room for the soldiers. The slaves could not be taken on board the transports. Their faces were sad and their hearts were heavier than before as we reluctantly turned from them, leaving them not only in slavery when freedom seemed just within their grasp, but to probable punishment and suffering because of their attempt at escape. That raid was in the autumn of 1862. President Lincoln had issued his proclamation, under date of September 22, declaring that all slaves should be emancipated on the 1st of January, 1863, in every state where armed rebellion still existed. We were interested to learn how this news affected the slaves and their masters. While we rested at Hamilton, as the gunboats on the stocks were burning, we chatted with the slaves who stood about watching proceedings. An intelligent slave, who was assistant foreman of the shipyard, was a good specimen of the shrewd, reticent, observing Negro. Evidently his family lived in the neighborhood, and all his worldly interests centered there. He was not going to say or do anything, while we were present, which could be reported to his injury when we had gone. Hence he was cautious and non-committal in answering our questions. "Uncle, have you heard about President Lincoln's proclamation?" "I's heard suthin." "What have you heard?" "Some says one thing, some says another." "Well, what do they say?" "Some say Massa Lincoln says 1st of January all de slaves go free. T'others say 'tain't so. There's nothin' in it." "But what do you think, uncle?" "Child," said the old man, looking his questioner straight in the eye, "I don't tink nothin'. I just stands a-waitin' and keeps a-hopin'." And that told the whole story for him, and for many another in those days. Governor Andrew of Massachusetts gave me an illustration of this shrewdness of the Negro in avoiding the compromising of himself when he was seeking information on a point of intensest personal interest. A friend of the governor from Boston was at a hotel in Charlestown, West Virginia, during the hurried trial of John Brown in 1859. In the early morning, before he had arisen, a slave came into his room, according to Southern custom, to kindle a fire for him to dress by. The excitement concerning John Brown was then at its height. Knowing that the guest was from the North, the Negro wanted to get his opinion of the case. Yet he was not sure that it would be safe to disclose his own views. "Massa," he said, "you hear about this man John Brown dey's tryin' here?" "Oh yes, I've heard about him." "What dey going to do with him?" Oh, they'll convict him. Convict him? What then? They'll hang him, sure as fate. There was yet no sign of the Northerner's sympathies. The Negro waited a minute, and then asked cautiously, "Wouldn't that be a little abrupt, massa?" Those who were within our lines in nominal freedom seemed impressed with the idea that, because learning to read had been forbidden them while in slavery, reading was somehow a means of power, which they must strive to acquire in order to fit themselves for their new sphere of being and acting, in competition with the white race. It was surprising how anxious they were to know how to read, and how zealous and earnest they were in endeavors to learn. While we were in camp on St. Helena Island, opposite Port Royal, South Carolina, there were 20 or 30 of these freed slaves who were personal servants of our regimental officers, field, staff, and line. In some way they had obtained 2 spelling books, or small readers, and these were in constant use among them. Not only in the intervals of active work during the day, but all through the night, some of these boys were poring over those books. Having got a start in their reading from some of the officers or privates, the more favored ones were always ready to help the others by their knowledge. They seemed to arrange among themselves so that all should have a share in the valued helps to learning at some time in each 24 hours. As I lay in my tent at night, and waked from time to time, I would hear low Negro voices, back of the tent, repeating words as from an elementary school reader. The hen is in the yard. The dog barks at the hen. Puss sits by the fire. She is warm. This boy is James. He drives a hoop. Now is the best time to do well, and so on. Hearing these sounds night after night, I was led to go out and look up their meaning. I found that back of the field and staff tents there was built a blazing fire of pine branches, under the moss-hung live oaks, before which some of these boys were poring over their treasured books, learning their lesson for the night. The flickering light in the deep shadows gave a weird look to the strange scene, but it was a vivid reality, and this I found was continued all through the night, week after week. It evidenced and illustrated the earnestness among the freed slave boys and their determination to learn how to read, in order to fill their sphere in freedom. Those who were too old, when they were freed, to learn to read, or to gain the advantages of an education, were all the more desirous that their children should attain the prize of knowledge which they had missed. This secured a full attendance at all the many schools for freed slaves, started along the coast within our lines by the various missionary associations and freedmen's aid societies at the North that undertook this work. The first school of this sort that I saw in operation was on St. Helena Island, in March 1863, although I later saw many others. With my friend and tentmate, Adjutant Camp, I rode the length of the long island to opposite Beaufort, on a pleasant spring day. The scenery of the island was typically southern. There was a tropical luxuriance of forest and foliage and all vegetation. Live oaks of massive growth, from which the long gray moss swung toward the ground, and among the branches of which the parasitic mistletoe showed itself with deep green leaves and berries like glistening pearls, were as the ribbed arches of an immense cathedral. Mammoth magnolias, just bursting into bloom, were to be seen on every side. The bay tree in its freshness and symmetry, the feathery cypress in its graceful delicacy, the flowering dogwood, the wild hawthorn, and the towering Spanish bayonet with its sword-shaped leaves and its snow-white blossoms crowning the long stem that looked like Aaron's rod that budded, stood here and there along our wooded way. Covering over, in places, the rich green masses of abounding shrubbery, were the golden flowers of the fragrant yellow jessamine vines, while among the foliage the wild honeysuckle in its crimson beauty, the scarlet yapon berries, and the purple clusters of the wild plum, peered out, and birds of bright plumage and sweet song flitted from branch to branch, giving life and variety to the gorgeous scene. End of section 42. Section 43 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 14, Part 3. In the open space beyond the first stretch of woods, there was an immense sea island cotton field, where black men and women by the score were at work, under government superintendence, in the hope of a summer's crop. Yet nearer the shore, stately palmetto and palm trees stood out against the horizon, and the prickly pear jealously guarded its tempting fruit by its nettle covering and its thorny encircling leaves. Plantation fences with gates divided the different fields. The old-time planter's mansion was there, and the Negro cabins were back of it. There was a pretty Episcopal church with a painted clock face in its gable end, and about it was a graveyard with stones marking the resting place of successive generations in an order of things now passing away. At last we reached a little Baptist church, where we found a Negro school of between 100 and 200 contrabands, as they were called in that day, under the care of cultivated and devoted New England women teachers. We were surprised and delighted at the brightness and proficiency of these children, as shown in their various recitations. The children themselves were the blackest of Africans, with no intermixture of white blood. At the close of the session they sang together, and their singing was a treat. First they sang a hymn written expressly for them, for the Christmas before, by John G. Whittier, including the verses, "Oh, none in all the world before were ever glad as we. We're free on Carolina's shore. We're all at home and free. We hear no more the driver's horn, no more the whip we fear. This holy day that saw thee born was never half so dear. Come once again, O blessed Lord, come walking on the sea, and let the mainlands hear the word that sets the islands free." Then they sang some of their native words in their own way, and that singing seemed to suit better their tastes and feelings. Death is a little man. Good Lord, remember me. And he goes from door to door. Good Lord, remember me. I praise de Lord when de year rolls round. Good Lord, remember me. Oh, I wants to die like Jesus died. Good Lord, remember me. To die and be laid in the grave. Good Lord, remember me. And so the lines went on, describing the resurrection and the ascension, and being repeated indefinitely. Accompanying the singing, the little singers beat time with their feet and clapped their hands, weaving their bodies back and forward, until they were aroused to a high state of excitement. This they would keep up, at times, by the hour, we were told. Indeed, there seemed to be no end to the singing, except in physical exhaustion. While the young Negroes could learn to read more easily than the older ones, they could not sing with the touching pathos of those who had suffered long in slavery with no clear hope of freedom. It was while crossing the saltwater ferry from Ladies Island, just above St. Helena, to Beaufort, on this occasion, that I first heard this genuine slave singing. It was a ferry boat, propelled by half a dozen stalwart Negroes. As they rowed, they sang. The bow oarsmen sang the words, and all joined in the chorus. The strain was plaintive, subdued, pathetic, such as could have come only from an oppressed, downtrodden, suffering people, disconsolate as to this life, and with hope only above and beyond. The words were few and simple, but they breathed a loving, longing, trustful spirit. My Jesus made the blind to see. No man can hinder me. My Jesus made the dumb to speak. No man can hinder me. My Jesus made the lame to walk. No man can hinder me. Thus they sang on of the work of Jesus, and as they sang they would, at regular intervals, strike one another's oars as if to mark time and secure harmony. the touching, tender allusion to my Jesus, as if the plaint of an innermost crushed soul, was inexpressibly pathetic. It beggars description. It brought tears to my eyes, and made me thank God for the preciousness of that name which is above every name, and which brings hope and comfort to those in every condition. The religious nature of the Negro showed itself in his songs of work and of worship, in his prayers, and in his exhortations and responses in sacred assemblings. Because of his Oriental origin, he was necessarily emotional and mercurial, and because of his peculiar training in slavery, he had his own ideas of morals, as apart from his religious spirit and thoughts. Taught by those who ought to know the right, that he was a mere chattel and not a responsible personality, and trained to the necessity of concealing his real hopes and desires from those who had more power over him than sympathy with him, it was not strange that he had confused ideas as to the limits of truth and honesty. Brought up to look at marriage as a convenience for the increase of his master's property possessions, he could hardly comprehend the highest teachings as to chastity and a pure and permanent family life. Yet it was not true, as was often asserted, that the Negro slave wholly divorced morals from religion, conduct from character, works from faith. I saw this in the first Negro sermon which I heard at New Bern. The preacher was a well-known itinerant Negro evangelist, who had come on his round to visit that city. He said he would, by urgent request, preach a funeral that morning. Then I learned that where the slaves could not have the services of a preacher regularly, they were glad to have now and then a sermon preached as if in memory of those who had died since the last occasion of the sort. This they called preaching a funeral, and it was such a discourse to which I listened at that time. It was evident that the preacher could not read the Bible, and that he had misunderstood some of its words by the sound, but he had manifestly imbibed the spirit of its teachings in spite of all his disadvantages. He announced his text for the morning as in the 5th verse of Mark, "Lo, I come." Hear that, brethren. Lo, I come. Not, hi, I come. The Lord Jesus comes to the poor and the lowly. That's a comfort. This was bad exegesis, but it was good gospel, and so in other parts of his discourse. It treated of life, death, and the hereafter, and of Jesus as sufficient for help, hope, and salvation, in all. Practical and timely truths were put in homely and forceful phrases, so that all could comprehend them. Although intended as a sermon of comfort to mourners, and of cheer to the oppressed, it made no suggestion that mere suffering in this life secured happiness and glory in the next. Jesus had taken to himself every follower of his, brother or sister, as the case might be, who had showed loving trust in him by doing as he commanded. And so it would be with all who were still here. Their future would surely conform to the service of their well-used present. "The Lord will put you in just a place you be done fit for," he said. "He wants to give you a good place, and he will if you're done fit for it. You know how 'tis yourself. Some of you make shoes. When you gets a piece of leather, you wants to use it all if you can. You looks it over. You say, that'll do for the quarters. That'll do for the vamps. That'll do for the fillin'. When you examine it over, and pick out what you can use, then you say of the rest, there ain't no more good there. That goes to the trash pile. Brethren, the Lord'll look you all over, and he'll put you where you belong. If you belong in a good place, he'll put you there. But if you ain't done fit for no good place, you got to go to the trash pile. You have, sure." That was as explicit as to the need of works as evidencing faith as the teaching of St. James or St. Paul. And such preaching I heard many times repeated, by Negro preachers, in various places along the coast. With his imaginative and religious nature as it was, and with his peculiar training and experiences in bondage as they had been, necessitated to conceal his feelings and his knowledge, for his own safety, the Negro freedman was inevitably a bundle of contradictions, sure to be misunderstood by many. In one aspect he seemed the veriest coward, afraid of his shadow. In another he seemed almost indifferent to danger, and at times truly courageous, braving punishment or death fearlessly. To some he seemed simple and unsuspecting as a child. To others he showed himself cautious, suspicious, shrewd. To yet others he appeared merely stupid, devoid of intelligent purpose, thought, or feeling. There was reason, however, for all this, and the seeming inconsistencies were not so great as they seemed. To the Negro mind the unseen world was more real than the seen. The Negro feared God reverently, and he was afraid of the devil and his minions almost abjectly. In his ignorance he knew no more about the precise limits of the spiritual realm than his more intelligent white fellows knew. But he had a far more abiding sense than many, who ought to be better informed, of the sure nearness to this life of the spiritual sphere beyond it. And he was, in consequence, more open, even though superstitiously so, to every influence or suggestion, actual or fancied, from the unseen realm about him. In accordance with the universal primitive belief that to utter the name of a being in the spiritual world is to summon that being to manifest himself, the Negroes deemed it wicked to speak the name of the devil, as such an utterance indicated either a league with the devil or a desire for him. My first Negro army servant spoke at one time of one of the excellent captains of our regiment, saying, "That captain's dreadful wicked man, Mr. Chaplain." "Wicked man?" I replied. "What makes you think that, Dick?" "I heerd him, sah, say right out, dat another man acted like de debbil. I did, sah, sure." He seemed to feel that this was proof that the fair-appearing, and seemingly well-disposed, young officer was given over to the arch-enemy of mankind, and I tried in vain to convince him that the good captain was not totally depraved. A belief in hants, or ghostses, or spooks, or sprites, seemed universal and positive among contrabands. It was not that they thought that there might be such things. They had never a doubt on the subject. A lawyer friend of mine attempted to bring a Negro army servant whom I well knew to the limits of positive proof, when this subject came under discussion. "Do you believe in ghosts, Henry?" "Believe in 'em, sah? What do you mean, sah?" As if he could not understand such an absurd and unmeaning question. "Do you believe that there are such things?" "Believe it, sah? I know there be, sah," he replied, with a pitying smile at the questioner's skepticism. "Did you ever see a ghost yourself, Henry?" "See 'em, sah? Yes, sah, many a time." "When did you see one last?" "Last night, sah." "How did you see it?" "I just look out in the night and see 'em, sah." "What did they look like?" "Can't tell you, sah. Dey was ghostses." "Did they look like dead men?" "No, sah. Dey was ghostses." End of section 43. Section 44 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 14, Part 4. This Negro was a simple-hearted, trusting believer in Jesus as his personal friend and Savior. He had no special fear of ghosts, nor of any evil powers in the world of spirits, for he rested on God's protection at all times. Yet he had no more doubt as to the reality of ghosts than he had as to the reality of dead men or living men, or of God, or of the devil. The fact that he could not describe or explain their appearance was no more perplexing to him than the inability of a lineman on an electric road to describe or explain electricity as a force in the universe. And he was so far a representative Negro, in slavery or out of it, as I saw that race in wartime. With this imaginative and superstitious nature, the Negro showed surprising credulity as to many a simple matter beyond his sphere of actual sight or experience. Yet again he showed courage and character. In our last year of Army service in Virginia, my tent mate and I had 2 contraband servants in common. The one a stalwart young Negro named Creed, very black, very quiet, saying little, showing little emotion, but very efficient and faithful as a body servant. The other an older man named Columbus, who had been trained as a jockey on the race course, who took care of our horses. Creed proved so valuable a body servant and was evidently so warmly attached to us that one day I suggested to him that if we lived through the war, he might go north with us and be our servant there. At this he showed signs of shrinking terror which I could not account for, but I saw plainly that he did not relish the thought of being at the North, where his friends, the Union soldiers, came from. Therefore I questioned him on the subject. "Why don't you want to go north, Creed?" I asked. "'Fraid of Yanks, sah." "Why are you afraid of Yanks?" "Yanks up north kill colored men, sah. Hang 'em, burn 'em, cut 'em up, sah." Such stories had been told him as a slave, in order to make him fear the North and Northerners, and he, with others, supposed that there must be some truth as their basis. He implicitly trusted the Union soldiers as God-sent deliverers, but he was afraid of the Negro-hating Yankee ghouls, whom he had come to believe abounded in the North. He did not for a moment seem to associate Union soldiers with Yanks. Old Columbus, a gray-haired, limping Negro, was well known as a jockey in the vicinity of Richmond, and he fully understood horses. When he escaped through the lines to our camp, the Richmond Examiner reported that he had been ill-treated and hanged by us. As we read to him this story, from a paper we had secured at the picket lines, a sly smile came over his face as if he knew more about the Yankees now than his old masters, and he said that, 'fore long, he would have his wife and son on our side of the lines, by a little designin'. In facing actual danger, Creed showed that he was no coward. He never shirked or wavered under fire. One day, in the Petersburg trenches, our regiment occupied the extreme picket front. The enemy's lines were not more than a stone's throw from ours at that point. Sharp firing was going on at noonday. We who were in the trenches kept close under cover just then. To show a head above the works was sure to bring a shot from the enemy. Creed came in sight from the camp at the rear, bringing our dinner. As we saw him in a traverse beyond, we called out to him not to mount the bank above it, as he would surely be fired at, and we would wait for our dinner until its bringing was safer. Undaunted, Creed showed himself on the crest of the hill, a conspicuous mark for the sharpshooters. Bullets flew about him, and a spherical case shot bowled past him. With measured strides he kept on, swinging his dinner pail, as if he had no consciousness of impending danger, until the shower of bullets was past, and he had reached the trench where we sat under cover. "We call to you to stop back out of the fire, Creed," we said. "Might as well come on, sah, unless a bullet stop me. I's bringin' your dinner, sah. If I go down, sah, now's good times ever." He had the soldier's sense of duty, and he would not shrink. He was afraid to face unreal Yankee ghouls of whom he had been told. He was not afraid to face real sharpshooters, whom he could see, in his path of duty. Was that man a craven coward, or was he a brave soldier? He was indeed so well known throughout the regiment for his courage and willing helpfulness, that my tent mate said facetiously that the chaplain was known by his creed in that regiment. Old Columbus I noticed one evening in the group gathered at our regimental prayer meeting. After the meeting I spoke to him, and was pleased at the hearty way in which he expressed his trust in Jesus as his Savior. I asked him if he had understood what I said in the meeting. "Oh yes," he replied, I know your chat. I can't read nor write, but I know your chat." I had been speaking of Joseph in the house of Potiphar, in the Egyptian prison, and in the palace of Pharaoh, protected and cared for everywhere because he trusted the Lord, and the Lord was with him. It was evident that Columbus had understood my chat. It's just so what you tell about Joseph. You can't go nowhere where Jesus can't find you. You go down to the bottom of the sea, and he find you there. He find Jonah there. He find Daniel in the lion's den. Wherever you is, there's just a place for Jesus to find you. Thus he went on in his childlike faith. Although he could not read nor write, he evidently got more comfort out of the Bible truths learned from others' chat than many have gained from their study of books. When finally my tent mate, Major Camp, was killed, and I went north with his body, Creed accompanied me in spite of imaginary dangers. The North, as he found it, was so different from what he had imagined that it was like a revelation to him. My wife and daughters showed an interest in him as a man, not as a chattel, because of what they had known of his fidelity to their loved one. It was a new and unexpected experience for him. After we were again in camp together, that home in the North was another place to him. His mind was full anew. Creed came in, one cold autumn day, to pile wood on our cabin fire. "Mr. Trumbull," no longer Mr. Chaplain, but Mr. Trumbull, he said, without looking up, "when you gwine ride home again?" "I'm writing today," I said. "Just give my specs to Missa Trumbull and to Miss Sophia and to Miss May. Tell 'em I wish I could see 'em again. I dream about 'em every night." "You dream about them nights?" I said. "Yes, sah, every night. I s'pose there isn't an hour of the day that I isn't studying 'bout 'em. I wish I could see 'em again." That was the longest speech I had ever heard from Creed, and it showed more of his inner feelings. My answer was, "Well, Creed, I hope we shall go back there together by and by." "Yes, sah," he said, as he passed out of the cabin, and I saw that he realized that the dwellers at the North were not all Yankee ghouls. This world was another world to him. Heaven was not all beyond. The bundle of contradictions was being unraveled in his case. That many of the slaves were treated kindly by their owners, and that they were warmly attached to those who controlled them, was a fact beyond question. Many Southern masters were even more considerate of the slaves than the Northerners, in the army and out of it. I had occasion to know of some outrageous ill-treatment of Negroes, in their property and their persons, by riotous Union soldiers on St. Helena Island while I was there. And on the other hand, I knew Negroes in most of the states of the Atlantic coast who were considered tenderly by their owners, and who in return sincerely loved those who gave them this treatment. Yet the slaves as a class were in sympathy with the Union Army in the progress of the war, and were opposed to the efforts of the Confederate Army. Not because they loved Southerners less, or Northerners more, but because they really believed that God was working by means of the Northern Army for the carrying out of his plans for the freeing of an oppressed people in his own good time and way. In this great issue, as they saw it, the Negroes were on God's side, even though they had to work against masters to whom they were attached, and to befriend Union soldiers who were not personally kind or fair toward them. It was with them not a question of mere feeling, but one of positive duty. There was in this a certain likeness to the position of the white leaders on the two sides in the Great War. It was not a plain question of loyalty and disloyalty, of allegiance and treason, that marked the line of separation. It was a question as to the proper object of loyalty and allegiance, as to where true loyalty rested. General Grant and General Lee were alike in their spirit and purpose of loyalty, as they understood the issue. But General Grant felt that loyalty was due to the federal government, and General Lee that it was due to his native state. Each loved his state and his nation, but the one deemed the nation paramount, the other the state. On this issue the war was fought out. So with the Negro. He may have loved his earthly master, but he loved his heavenly master more. If his earthly master fought against God in this conflict, the Negro gave his sympathy and help to those whom he deemed on God's side, even though it brought him against those to whom he was personally attached. That was the way the Negro looked at it. With all the exceptions to it, this was the rule. This putting of religion as above mere personal interests was more prominent with the Negro than was commonly understood. It often showed itself in other things besides the question of emancipation. For instance, in St. Augustine there was a little Negro girl about 8 or 10 years old, who had been brought out of slavery, and was in the care of Northerners, where she was affectionately treated and ministered to. But she had been brought up a Roman Catholic, and was now being trained as a Protestant. One day, when the freedmen about her were rejoicing over the thought of emancipation, someone asked this child, without a doubt as to what the answer would be, "Rebecca, would you like to go back into slavery again?" "If I could have my own religion again, I would," was the unexpected reply. Slavery, with all its privations, was to that little Negro but a small matter in comparison with the being deprived, as now, of the privilege of worshiping God as she thought he would have her worship. This may seem to some strange and unreasonable, but it must be recognized as in accordance with the nature of many a Southern Negro. Nor is it really to be wondered at, with the strength of the religious sentiment in human nature as it is. It is said by many Southerners that a great majority of the slaves were faithful to their masters, working for them in the army, or while they were absent from home in the war. And it is known that in many instances they helped to provide for their impoverished masters after the war was over and they were free. Yet it is unmistakably true that the slaves were, as a class, always ready to befriend a Union soldier in prison at great personal risk, or to conceal one who had escaped, and to assist him to regain the Union lines. These things may seem to be inconsistent, but they were a not unnatural part of the Negro bundle of contradictions, and they can be understood by one who studies them in the light of these leading facts and principles. After President Lincoln's proclamation of emancipation was made known among the slaves, they seemed to have no doubt of its sure realization, even though it was yet but a declaration on paper, and its value was dependent on the issue of the war. On the 1st of January, 1864, I was in St. Augustine. The freedmen in that quaint old town had a joyous celebration of this first anniversary of the proclamation of emancipation. The idea was wholly their own, and they had charge of all the details of the plan, including the preparation of the entertainment, although the military authorities gave them help as they requested it. End of section 44. Section 45 of War Memories of an Army Chaplain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brian Keenan. War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull. Chapter 14, Conclusion. The blacks, old and young, were out in full force, and bedecked in all the finery they could command. They gathered on the old Spanish plaza in the center of the town, and had exercises appropriate to the occasion. Then they invited their white guests, military and civic, to a collation spread in the upper room of the old government building, just west of the plaza. It was astonishing what a generous display of fine cakes and confections those pastry cooks and other blacks had provided for the occasion, and what delight they had in serving it in their best style, out of their overflowing joy and gratitude. One old Uncle Tom, white-haired, smiling-faced and tearful-eyed, after passing from group to group of the merry throng, with a fuller appreciation of the import of the whole affair in contrast with his past, and in earnest of the future of his long enslaved and now emancipated people, said to me, out of the depths of his brimming heart, "I just thank de Lord I eber lived to remember dis day. Bress de Lord, bress de Lord." Like Simeon of old, welcoming the coming of the holy babe, he was sure that God's promised deliverer had come to proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. From that day to this his trembling voice has sounded in my ears, as if he were saying, in rejoicing over fulfilled prophecy, "Now lettest thou thy servant depart, O Lord, according to thy word, in peace. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation." The Emancipation Proclamation bore date of January 1, 1863. It was sealed and delivered at Appomattox Courthouse, April 9, 1865. What had before been a glad promise then became an accomplished fact. Only those who witnessed the scenes following that event can have any apprehension of the mighty outburst of rejoicing that went up from a race of 4 millions of slaves enfranchised in a moment. My regiment was in the victorious column of the 24th Army Corps, that turned back from the scene of Lee's surrender to find rest and quarters in evacuated Richmond. At every point along the route, the Negroes swarmed out to welcome and honor the army which had won them freedom. They shouted their thanks to them. They called down blessings on their heads. They threw themselves on the ground before them, as the column passed along, hailing them as their deliverers. Yet, under and back of all this outburst of rejoicing, and of welcome and thanks to the Union soldiers, there was manifest the feeling, on the part of the enfranchised race, that it was God's work, and that to him was the praise due. They had long prayed, as they waited, for this day, and at last it had come in response to their prayers. Of this they had no doubt. As a comrade told me, at one point an old Negro mammy, waving her bony arms, shouted to the passing soldiers, above the welcoming cry of the younger blacks, "Dun you think yer did it? De Lord done it all. He just used yer, that's all. Bress de Lord, every one yer." And that it was God's work, who can doubt? In Richmond for a time the Negro seemed supreme, and he evidently felt that he was. It could hardly be supposed that a race just out of bondage would be at once in a state of equilibrium and of entire self-restraint, saying and doing just and only the right thing. But I am describing what I saw and heard, without attempting a defense of it. The blacks on all sides were telling of their joy in their newfound liberty, which they did not always distinguish from unrestrained license. "I were just so happy when I knowed it, that I couldn't do nothing but just lay down and laugh, and laugh and laugh," said one. "I could just roll up and laugh. I declare I just felt as happy as a man's got religion in his soul." Another chimed in with, "Folks say man can't tote a barrel of flour, but I could tote a barrel of flour dat day, or a barrel sugar." Said another, with evident appreciation of the privileges of a freedman, "I seed a rebel gwine down de street dat mornin' wid a big ham, and I just took dat ham, and runned right down de street. He hollered me to stop, but I just keep dat ham." Many of the Negroes wanted to tell of the contrast between the old days and these. "We have more liberty in an hour, when you Yankees come, than in all our lives 'fore." Some of them would burst out with recitals of their sufferings as slaves. "Dey part us all. Dey send off our families. Dey send us where dey please. Dey handcuff us. Dey put us in jail. Dey give us lashes. Dey starve us. They do everything to us." The colored Union soldiers of the 25th Army Corps, who were with us in Richmond, were moving about among their released brethren, telling of their military exploits, and they were, of course, lions among the freedmen. Describing their advance over the Confederate works across the New Market Road, as they were the first to enter Richmond, on Monday morning, April 3, one said, "We wait for the daylight, 'cause of torpedoes, and then we have rebel soldiers throw us away. Whew, the torpedoes just as thick as the wool on top of my head." Of the reception of the colored troops by their Richmond brethren, he added, "The people just think all the world of we Northern soldiers. They just hang about us and compliment us. I seed some of our boys going down the streets with their Richmond ladies on their arm. Oh my, you'd 'a think 'twas a extra." And it was. Of course, the freed slaves were unable to comprehend at once all that emancipation brought of new obligations to service, and of added responsibility of toil for their own support. That had to come gradually. They did indeed, at the start, enjoy making money by trade in the line of the wants of the Union soldiers, or of the needs of the community and their own personal skill. The camps about Richmond were soon beset with black women and children, offering sweets and snacks of their own cookery. Small tables were set along the streets and roads with milk and ice cream and lemonade and cakes for sale, to tempt the passing soldiers. And rude signs were scrawled over cabins and small shops, as if in the hope of bringing in extra pennies for service for old customers or new. The announcement, in one case, of ice cream and children's haircut showed a commendable readiness to cut or cater for whoever would pay for it. They were ready to provide for themselves if they did not have to work too hard. A friend of mine coming from the North just then with enthusiastic ideas of the Negro's ability to grapple with every duty of life, told me of his observation among freedmen on the seacoast. He saw a group of able-bodied black men who had apparently come down from the country to enjoy their liberty. As he asked them what they were doing for their own support, they said they were doing nothing. When he asked why not, they said there was no one to employ them. Just then a man came up from a lumber schooner lying at the dock nearby, and wanted a number of men to work at unloading the cargo. Not one of those freedmen could be hired. "I thought you wanted work," said my friend. "Now is your chance to take hold." "Oh, massa, we wants work, but we don't want no laborin' work." Their idea of a desirable job was, as yet, that which keeps many a white man from doing what he ought to do for his own support. But sooner or later the freedmen learned that emancipation brought the privilege and duty of doing laborin' work in order to live. During the early days of the confused Reconstruction period, sidelights on slavery and emancipation as related to the whites were to be seen in Richmond that are well worth remembering. My old commander, General Alfred H. Terry, was in charge of the Department of Virginia, and his chief of staff in that position was my longtime friend, General Joseph R. Hawley. As Richmond was still a center of interest to Confederate leaders generally, and was the prominent point of the quondam Confederacy nearest to the national capital, it was the scene of many an interesting interview and discussion between those who had faced each other as enemies, but now met as friends. I was frequently in the office at department headquarters. The United States government had promised transportation from Richmond to all officers and men of the Confederate Army desiring to return to their homes. One day, a gentleman in civilian dress came in and applied for such transportation. When asked his name, he answered modestly, J. E. Johnston. General Hawley, hearing the name, started up and asked, "Is this General Joseph E. Johnston?" "That's what they called me," was the reply. At this, General Hawley said that he was sure that General Terry would be glad to meet General Johnston personally, and the three officers were soon together, talking over war memories earnestly and in excellent spirit. On one occasion, General Henry A. Wise, governor of Virginia at the time of the John Brown raid, came into the office to apply for the intervention of General Terry to repossess him of a building on his lands in the eastern part of the state. In the course of the conversation, it came out that that building was now occupied as a school for little Negroes, taught by a daughter of old John Brown, whom he had had hanged. The disclosure of this fact caused a friend of General Wise, who was present, to comment on the strange turn of affairs by which, within 6 years from the execution of John Brown, the governor who hanged him was imploring the help of the United States government to drive one of John Brown's daughters out of the governor's house, where she was teaching little Negroes. To the surprise of all, General Wise responded earnestly, John Brown was a great man, sir. John Brown was a great man." Henry A. Wise was man enough to realize that God's ways of working seem different when looked back upon in accomplished history, and when seen distortedly coming toward us through the mists of personal prejudices and fears. General Hawley told me of having a long personal talk with Governor Wise, at one time, about that same John Brown. The governor spoke of Brown with great respect. He saw him at the time of Brown's capture, and was much impressed. Among other remarks of the governor about Brown were these: he was a very remarkable man. There he lay on the floor of the engine house, leaning upon one elbow, smutty, dusty, and bloody, reasoning with me with great earnestness upon the exceeding sinfulness of slavery, trying to make an abolitionist of me. He forgot that he was certainly about to be hanged, and that I was the chief executive, in whose hands was his life. Harriet Beecher Stowe's graphic delineation of slavery as it was, in the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin, was at the time of its writing much discussed and bitterly denounced, both North and South. But when slavery had become the occasion of a war which united all the North, that story was dramatized and became popular in the theaters of New York. The stage, which never attempts to lead public sentiment in an unpopular direction, can always be depended on to follow at a paying distance behind the average public sentiment in a question of morals. And so that story became familiar to many who now wanted to believe the worst that it told of a representative institution of the South. After the war, many Southerners who came North went to see that play of Uncle Tom's Cabin, although they had never read the book. 2 of my acquaintances, the one from Missouri and the other from South Carolina, went together, in this way, to see it performed in a popular New York theater. As they left the theater at the close of the evening, as my Missouri friend informed me, the South Carolinian walked along for some time without saying a word, and then laconically expressed himself. "Will, that's what licked us." And it was not strange that he thought so. The North, it must be remembered, had a full share of responsibility for slavery with its evils at the South. The South has a full share of the blessings of emancipation brought about by the outpouring of the best blood of both North and South. President Rutherford B. Hayes, when addressing his military companions, on one occasion, with reference to the conflicts of our Civil War, said that never before in the history of the world did the victors in a great conflict gain as much as was won in this instance by the vanquished, and this in addition to what was gained by the victors. It is, therefore, well for us to consider now these plain truths about slavery as it was, and about emancipation as it came to pass, lest we forget. End of section 45. End of War Memories of an Army Chaplain by Henry C. Trumbull.